Great, good morning. Welcome, everyone. It is so good to see everybody here this morning, and we're gonna wait a couple of beats while people sort of filter in. But just to remind you, my name is Kristen Mariah. I'm an assistant professor of English at Queen's University, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. Thank you so much for joining us here on the second day of Shadd Cary in the Here and Now, a digital symposium dedicated to fostering new scholarship about the life, times, and work of Shadd Cary. As a reminder, we at Dig Black have a code of conduct for all of our events. In accordance with the Center for Black Digital Research's principles, our code of conduct allows CBDR to create the best experience possible for all attendees. We are dedicated to providing a harassment-free environment for everyone, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, age, sexual orientation, ability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, or religion, or lack thereof. We do not tolerate harassment of participants in any form. Sexual language and violent imagery is not appropriate during any aspect of this virtual event/conference, including talks, workshops, parties, social media, such as Twitter or other online media. And as a reminder, during the panel, we encourage you to drop questions into the chat, and we'll try our best to answer them during the Q&A. And now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Irene Moore-Davis. Irene Moore-Davis is a Windsor, Ontario-based educator, writer, historian, activist, and podcaster. She frequently speaks about diversity, inclusion, equity, and African Canadian history. She fulfills a variety of community roles, including president of the Essex County Black Historical Research Society, co-chair of Black Women of Forward Action, co-host of All Right in the Sin City podcast, and program chair at Bookfest Windsor. Irene was co-executive producer of the award-winning short documentary, The North Was Our Canaan. Her new documentary project is entitled Across the River to Freedom, and it's going to be released in 2022. A seventh-generation African Canadian whose ancestral families include the Shadds, Irene is an administrator at St. Clair College, where she also teaches English, Underground Railroad history, and Black cultural studies. We are so fortunate that Irene will be moderating our panel this morning. Thank you so much, Irene.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome, and welcome everybody. Thrilled to be here today to help facilitate this important discussion on activating archives and anniversaries. Let me introduce our panelists. Lopez D. Matthews Jr. is the digital production librarian at Howard University Libraries and the Moorland Spingarn Research Center. He is a commissioner on the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture and a member of the board of directors of the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland, African American History and Culture in Baltimore. He has published several articles and is the author of Howard University in the World Wars, Men and Women Serving the Nation. In 2020, he became a senior advisor to the U.S. Truth, Healing, and Transformation Leadership Group. Welcome, Lopez D. Matthews Jr. Melissa J. Nelson is a second-generation Jamaican Canadian from Toronto, Ontario. Melissa currently works as the research assistant in equity and diversity for McGill University School of Information Studies. Prior to this, she held archival positions and placements at George Brown College Archives, the Presbyterian Church in Canada Archives, the Law Society of Ontario Archives, and Clara Thomas Archives and Special Collections at York University. Melissa conducts research and produces content on history and archive-related topics for her website, melissajnelson.com. Welcome, Melissa J. Nelson. I'd also like to introduce Curtis Small. Curtis Small is the coordinator of public services for special collections at University of Delaware, where he coordinates the reference, instruction, and exhibition programs. Curtis' research interests include the history of the African American book, the history of the colored conventions movement, and Caribbean Francophone literature. Welcome, Curtis Small. And Sean Smith is a senior archivist in the Collections Development and Management Unit at the Archives of Ontario, located in Toronto. He previously held positions at the Clara Thomas Archives at York University and Library and Archives Canada. In total, he has been preserving and sharing history for over 20 years. During the pandemic, he has been focused on issues related to archives and community engagement, developing a GLAM wiki presence for the Archives of Ontario and digital records. Welcome, Sean Smith, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. So let's begin with some questions. I want to begin with the question, how has the legacy of Marianne Shadd Cary impacted your professional work? I'd like to throw that first to Sean, if I may. How has the legacy of Marianne Shadd Cary impacted your professional work?
Sure. I think the most obvious thing to point out is I'm here amongst a group of international scholars talking about what archives can do to activate the legacy of Marianne Shadd Cary. Listening to the speakers yesterday and understanding sort of the migration patterns of Marianne Shadd Cary, she went to so many different places to meet people and to talk about issues. And that's exactly what we're doing today, which is, I think, a great testament to sort of her legacy. From my professional point of view and from the point of view of the Archives of Ontario, this past 18 months, 2 years has really been a transformational period for the archives. It's been a period where we've been sort of challenging our own paradigms to sort of start thinking more in terms of how we can be in service to communities, how we can really be more humble and aware of the material that we house and that we are supporting, and really thinking through how we can be more forward with it and reaching out to the people who really sort of benefit from having access to that. So I think we started really looking at how we could sort of make records related to Black histories more public using our GLAM Wiki initiative, but that's also brought us in contact with the Transcribe Shadd project out of Penn State University. It's led to us sort of looking back at sort of past relationships that the archives have had and seeing how we can be how we can support sort of the preservation of those materials in a more meaningful way, and using the apparatuses that we now have access to, digitization, for example, to sort of really take that material and get it out in front of the public. And that has been exactly what Marianne Shadd Cary has afforded us. It's just the opportunity to sort of work with that material. Hopefully, once we're able to be back in our building to digitize it and to share it with an international audience, and to really have conversations that are meaningful in ways that we can not only get people to understand more about what we do at the Archives of Ontario and what our interests are, but mostly just how we can be of service to communities who really need the materials to sort of tell their own stories.
Thank you. I'm going to throw the same question to Melissa J. Nelson. How has the legacy of Marianne Shadd Cary impacted your professional work?
Yeah, so I would say for me, growing up in Canada and realizing how buried Canadian history, Black Canadian history is, and learning about Marianne Shadd Cary and how significant she was, how significant Black political organizing was, how significant Black figures were, and how important it is that this is visible, that this is included in the education system. So in my work, I center Black scholars. I have a workshop that is reoccurring, is coming up again, on anti-Black records and archives, and how scholars do look for those records. Black scholars look for those records, and it's very important for their work. And so I center Black scholars and their needs to be able to locate records and the importance of visibility of these records, and just speak to a bit of their experiences in archives and how important it is for Black scholars to be able to do the work to bring visibility to Black Canadian history and our experiences in Canada.
Okay, and Lopez D. Matthews Jr., same question.
I think in terms of looking at the way we manage our collections at Moreland, having Marianne Shadd Cary collection really adds to what Dorothy Porter Wesley was seeking to create when she built the archive, creating this mosaic of the Black experience. She really wanted to build an archive that spoke to every aspect of the Black experience. And so having collections related to Black women, Black men, women of achievement, but then also regular African Americans. So I think that having someone like her, who is, of course, a Howard graduate, someone who accomplished so much, someone who fought for Black rights, I think that it just helps us tell the story of Black people in totality, if that makes sense, you know, because that's what the goal was. The Moreland Springer Research Center came out of Kelly Miller's mind, and he wanted it to be a space where Black people were at the forefront of preserving and promoting the study of Black history. He was working with Carter G. Woodson, who founded the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and that was sort of their focus. And so having her collection amongst the other collections sort of adds to the goal of telling a complete story of the Black experience.
So why are archives and anniversaries specifically important for the work that you do, Melissa?
Why, by that you mean this conference?
Why are archives and anniversaries in general important for the work that you do?
Well, archives are really significant for being able to determine what we remember and what we forget. And that has had a tremendous impact on what we remember collectively about Black people and what Black people are even allowed to access in terms of records and scholarship, to understand our experiences in Canada, to understand the impact of the Canadian government on Black people, and to help us better understand ourselves. So that's why I'm very interested in being in the archive field, because I see the impact, the larger impact that it has, and the impact it has on Black communities.
Okay, thank you. Lopez, same question.
I think it's so important. I think the dates are important because that brings people's attention to what's in the collection. You know, that's what brings the wider attention. And so you get the numbers that then tell your administration, support me because people want to use my material. So that's why the dates are really important. In terms of the archives, though, I think they're really important just because they tell sometimes they tell the true story, and sometimes they tell the story that people want to create. Because, you know, sometimes the documents, while they're documents, they aren't really what happened, but they're what was recorded. And so, you know, I think that they tell a story. And I love to tell my student workers when they first start, kind of like a trigger warning, that these are the unencumbered stories of people's lives. Most of them, they didn't expect someone would be reading these letters 30, 40 years later. And so these are their unencumbered thoughts. So you have to keep that in mind. And that's what I love about archives, and why I love working with archives, is that you're reading something that's probably someone's truest self because it wasn't their public face, you know. Like me, I'm sitting here with my tie on, my shirt and everything, but the real me, you know, has on a t-shirt and I'm just laying around. And so that's why I love archives. And that's what I think is the importance of archives, because it strips away the veneer of your public face and lets you see, for the most part, who someone truly is. And that's what I love about it.
That is fascinating, this idea of sort of the shoes off version of these historical figures. I'm sure that your students must really relate to that.
Let me tell you, they found a letter in a very prominent figures collection that he wrote to his wife. And he was talking about his son going off to college. And he's saying, oh, you know, we're here. I wrote this off. I mean, I dropped him off. We did this, we did that. And then he added a PS that was very NSFW. And the student came and said, oh my God, look what he wrote. And I said, well, you just got to remember, this is a private letter to his wife. So, you know, you'll see things like that, you know, just like today, people do the texting. And so it's just like that. So that's why I just love it. I love it.
Tremendous. Sean, why are archives and anniversaries important for the work that you do?
Well, I think anniversaries provide an opportunity for archives to be relevant and to be part of a conversation and to contribute to celebrations, whatever they might be or however those may look. Um, I think for the most part, collections can just dwindle in an archives and get dusty and adhere to every stereotype that there is of an archives. But anniversaries, if archivists are self-aware and are knowledgeable of their collection, do provide an opportunity for us to make sure that stuff gets out and gets into the hands of people who are doing the commemorating and to start thinking about those things. So anniversaries are a point of reflection, both for the value of archives as well as the value of the organizations or individuals who are being commemorated or remembered during those significant periods. But they're also an important opportunity for engagement, for renewing relationships with donors who we may not have spoken to for 20 years. If we are, as we are at the Archives of Ontario, trying to think more concretely in terms of the documentation that we haven't been paying attention to, it's an opportunity for us also to reach out, understanding that there's an anniversary coming up and sort of saying, here's the point in your history where you're thinking about your past. What are you going to do about preserving it? Can we support you in doing that? And that doesn't mean that we have to be the custodians of anybody's records, but if there's anything that we can provide during those moments to sort of support memory work within communities, then that's something that's an opportunity for us to participate in or to move towards.
You've touched on something really important in that answer, which is individuals and families' reticence to hand over custodianship of their precious records. What are the ways in which you can overcome or find that you have been overcoming those expressions of reluctance?
Well, sort of the phrase I've been using is just us moving forward with active humility. The assumption, not moving, we're a large institution. We're the second largest archives in Canada. We're the provincial archives, which is the equivalent of a state archives in the US. We have a history of 100 years of collecting, which has left out a lot of communities and raises a lot of questions about what we've been up to. For us, I think it's giving over as much of our power as possible to community decisions. So not insisting or not assuming that the end result of any of these conversations is for us to acquire records, but it's to build relationships over time. It's for us to sort of start interacting with projects that are happening, granted projects, other types of projects, and just seeing how we can fit in. Can we support them by giving over our records? So for example, with the Glam Wiki project, it's a shift, it's a paradigm shift because we're giving up control over our images as best as we can, high-res images so that they can be used automatically and immediately in community projects. So it's just moving away from the idea of custodianship as the end result of any conversation and moving towards one of relationship, and not having expectations in terms of outcomes, but just really moving with the flow of those conversations and seeing where they go. I don't think that's something that archivists are comfortable with necessarily, but it's certainly something that we have to become more attuned to if we want to remain relevant in the present and in the future.
Melissa or Lopez, do you have any comments to add to that component of the conversation? You know, how archivists can encourage communities and individuals to come forward and share what they have or participate in partnerships of this kind?
Well, I think that with us, we just kind of emphasize the fact that, you know, we're not taking it from you. We're just preserving it to make it available. And that, you know, it's not, you know, that we're going to be custodians of the records, you know, that's what our goal is. Our goal isn't to make money from it. Our goal isn't to strip you of your copyright. Our goal isn't to, you know, take it from you. Our goal is just to be proper custodians of this history and this legacy and make them understand that that is our purpose and that is our goal. And that has been fairly helpful because, you know, sometimes people feel like, oh, you're coming to take it from me. And so they feel a loss of ownership. And, you know, we just kind of make sure that they understand that, no, it's not a loss of ownership. You're just ensuring that it's preserved in perpetuity. And that's our goal. And that's really all our purpose is. So that's kind of what we emphasize.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, you're nodding.
Yeah. I haven't had this experience of having to build relationships with communities for an archival institution, but I hear how they're both speaking to the importance of trying to understand the community that you want to work with and building relationships with them and trying to dispel any bias that they might have, because Black communities do typically perceive archives a certain way, and there is fear there is mistrust there. So the approach that they're both speaking to, it sounds like it's very important and impactful in the relationships that they're trying to build.
Well, this is really an important piece as we come up on Marianne Shadd Cary's 200th anniversary in 2023. And we certainly want to ensure that archives and that anniversary are really showcased and help to establish the importance of this event and this woman and her work and her networks for both countries and for memory and for possibilities. Moving on to the next question, I'm wondering, how can your institution or field continue to advance work that foregrounds Black women's political activism? And what changes would you like to see in this area? Melissa?
For me, that brings to mind how traditional practices are not, they're not created with Black records in mind. And so Black archivists and Black memory workers who are working with Black records, working with records that speak to Black political activism, they will likely have to adopt a methodology that is outside of that. And I have been part of conversations about potential creation of a Black archival studies. And I know University of Toronto is looking to hire an assistant professor for Black studies and archives. So I think what would really be significant in this field is if the methodologies that come from Black archivists and memory workers is recognized in the field and recognized in library and information studies programs, and something that can be adopted in archival institutions as well to support that work.
Okay, very good. And Sean, how does your institution or field continue to advance work that foregrounds Black women's political activism specifically, and what changes would you like to see in that area?
Yeah, so I think there's some things that are changing that I think are important to become a part of the profession as a whole to start thinking about. And that's kind of like for us to be more interested and involved in thinking about the gaps in our holdings, to start identifying sort of records that may be out there, or individuals out there who have been important to communities, Black communities here in Ontario, especially women, and really reaching out to them and sort of engaging in those conversations that sort of indicate that your historic records are important, and we want to support the preservation of them, whether that's through donating them to the Archives of Ontario or by placing them somewhere where they might be used. But I think, and I'm a white settler, and I'm totally biased, and I have a certain position of privilege when I speak about this, but my understanding from having worked with a number of communities is that archives are not something that people think about as their right or something that, I mean, our collections are predominantly white settlers, long established Ontario families who have had time, who have had security, who have had the opportunities to sort of really think about their legacies and to build a basement's worth of records and then donate them to the archives. But I think for us, it's important to be involved in organizations that are actually doing stuff here and now, and just planting the seed that the activities that are going on the ground need to be thought about long term. And as I said, whether that's by considering a donation at some point to the Archives of Ontario or to us, just getting into that conversation early enough that records for future generations to look back on will provide evidence of the important work that's being done in the here and now.
Okay, and Lopez, same question.
I think that for us, one of the things I want us to remember is kind of what our mission has been, in that, we have been tasked with preserving the Black experience, and understand that, if you look at our finding aids, they all say local practice on them. Because, and I always point back to Dorothy Porter Wesley, because when she saw that Black people and Black culture wasn't identified in like the Library of Congress subject headings, she created her own subject headings that better reflected the Black experience. And so what I think that we need to do is to remember that, and not sort of move towards, I know there's a standardization happening in the archival world, but remember that, we're an archive that has always focused on recognizing the culture that we're trying to preserve and trying to represent. And so we have to remember that while standardization is okay, and while there is a place for it, we also have to understand that we have to remember the culture, and remember that the culture isn't standard. And so you have to leave space for, like, this organization has a specific language that if you're not a part of that organization, you really won't understand it. And so we have to remember that you have to keep in mind the culture of the people that you're working with, and use your description and use your keywords and use these things toward the organization and toward the people. And so not to get so caught up in the standardization of it, and in that you forget what you're trying to represent and what you're trying to preserve. So I hope that that is something that people who are preserving these records remember, and that that's what stays in the future. Because I see a lot of reparative work happening, and is the reparative work erasing the culture, So that's and it's a fine line in that,
Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump back in?
Please.
Yeah, one other thing too. Sorry, I should have mentioned it when it was my time. So I do apologize for that. But I think another thing too, and it's really important, is archives need to also just be aware that when records of diverse communities are being donated to, a state archives or provincial archives, that there's a certain privilege. There's a certain we need to be understanding that that's not always going to be an easy thing to do. And so as archives and archivists, we really need to be clear about the fact that we understand that, and commit to working with that material equally to any other collection that we have in our holdings. And so I think what that really means is speaking with the donors, speaking with the communities, and understanding the wishes for that material. And then taking sort of the resources that we have at our disposal to do the most possible to make sure that material is made accessible, that it's widely dispersed if that's possible, and then it's shared amongst a number of research communities, so that it doesn't become material that just goes into the back of the vault, but it's material that gets showcased at the front of our website, and that we are doing our best, and we're building trust by making sure that we're going to follow through with our commitments to making sure that this material is treated and dispersed and is widely accessible as is possible.
And that is a really important distinction that you've just made. I mean, I know that many of us know that last year, lots of archives, lots of libraries, lots of collections suddenly threw to the front for performative purposes, whatever African descendant community stuff they had, and kind of tried to shine a light on it just to say, okay, we're good, we did this. But you're talking about a much more long-term and ongoing relationship building practice, right? So what is the role of community partnerships in this important work? And are there ways in which the spirit of Marianne Shadd Cary and Black organizing are impacting your practice? I'm going to throw this one to Sean.
All right, I'll just keep going. Community partnerships are extremely important. I think more important than they ever have been in the past. I think archival practice in the past has always been about us receiving donation offers, making considerations about whether we should be acquiring the material or not, and then going forward from that point forward. As I said, in many cases, the stuff gets put in the back of the vault and never comes out again. But I think community partnerships need to be in the forefront for helping us to understand how we're perceived, what we're doing right, what we're not doing right, whether we're relevant, whether we need to shift our practices to be more accommodating to a multiplicity of communities. Do people understand what it means when we describe stuff, or do we need to be more, we need to rethink that as well, so that we're speaking in language that that more people can understand, and that the records that we hold and we preserve are surfaceable and discoverable in our descriptive systems, which aren't always obvious. We don't understand communities the way that community members do. We have, you know, certain blinders, we have certain perspectives, and there's things that we do well. But for us to really sort of be relevant and to sort of reach out and to see how we can be of service to those communities, we really need to make inroads into those communities and listen to what community members say. So I recently had a conversation with someone who's working on the mapping Ontario's Black Archives project, and we talked about, you know, ways that we could be sort of working together. And you know, she wanted to understand what our acquisition interests were and our acquisition mandates. And I think the perspective that we're trying to get across is that our acquisition interests are your acquisition interests. We'll listen to you because you know the material better than we do. And if in your mapping of Ontario's Black Archives, you're surfacing collections that need a home and they make sense to come to the Archives of Ontario, then that's something that we want to be a part of. But it's not for us to determine that we know everything. And so community partnerships, relationships with communities is what's going to make for you know, a meaningful Archives of Ontario in the future.
Okay, thank you. Lopez, I'm throwing the same question to you. What is the role of community partnerships in this important work? And are there any ways in which the spirit of Marianne Shadd Cary and Black organizing impact your practice?
I think it's extremely important because all of this work is community work. You're preserving community stories. And so you almost have to partner with the community to get the work done, to tell the stories correctly, to make sure you're preserving the material properly. You know, we always encourage the organizations that we work with, particularly the people we work with, to come in and work with us as we process the material. I'm like, hey, you know it better than we do, so you'll make sure that we do it properly. We'll do it correctly. So if you want to come in, look at it. If something's incorrect, thank you, we'll fix it. You know, so we really encourage, you know, them to remain in contact and to work with us in the preservation of their material. Everyone, even if someone is, if they're alive and if they're there to do it, you know, work with us to make sure that it's preserved properly, that it's described properly, that, you know, we're doing it the right way, you know. And so and I think that's really the benefit of community partnerships, that you're working with the people who you're preserving their history, so that you do it in a correct and respectful way. And then also that you get the work done, you know. They sometimes very helpful with getting the funding to get the material processed, you know, or they fund it themselves. Hey, we want to make sure this is available, so we'll pay for it to be processed, you know. And so thanks. That helps. You know, the digitization is the new thing now. Oh, how can we get this digitized? And it's like, okay, well, here's the process to move toward digitization. So if you want to support that, come help support it. And so I think that there's just a multitude of ways that remaining connected to the communities that have donated their records and just maintaining active relationships can benefit the archives and the community. But also, and I didn't want to miss this because it almost floated out of my head, but also that you help them preserve the records that they are not interested in letting go just yet. If you're going to maintain records, okay, here's how you can best maintain the records that you're not interested in giving away just yet. And not even that you have to give it to us, but that is preserved so that it can be preserved in perpetuity. Not being proprietary, oh, when you have to give it to us, but that, okay, we're going to make sure that you're also maintaining what you hold as well.
Mm-hmm. And Melissa, what is the role of community partnerships in your work? And are there ways in which the spirit of Marianne Shadd Cary and Black organizing impact your practice?
So I would say in my work currently, I've been doing workshops, and I would be doing other events to work with Black professionals that want to create their own archives. But I would say, to speak to what both Sean and Lopez said, they really emphasized the importance of communities being involved in the decision making, and that it's really important for them to be involved in the decision making, for how records from their communities are processed, how it's made accessible, and I think that's very important for communities to be involved in that way.
Very good. And as I continue with my questions, I just want to reiterate to all of our guests today that you have the opportunity to post your questions in the chat. We will have a Q&A that starts shortly, and we'll look forward to having your questions answered too. So my next question is, what is at stake for your institution or field when it comes to centering Black political organizing materials and topics? Sean?
I think it's an enormous amount of credibility. We've been, as I said, over the last 18 months or so, we've been really trying to sort of shift the paradigm, both of the way that we operate outwardly and the way people perceive us. I think it's incredibly important for us to follow up on our commitments. And that includes with the Marianne Shadd Cary material. That's following through to the 200th anniversary, following through on our commitments to digitize the collection in its entirety, to share it widely, to work with other communities, to give that material over to local communities here in Ontario and communities across the border. You know, I think we've done some pretty good work, and we've started to develop some great conversations and some good relationships. But if we stop at any point in time, or if we stumble, or we don't follow through on our commitments, then there's a huge loss of credibility there. Our goal is to be the archives of all of Ontario, to be able to sort of incorporate the stories of all the people of Ontario and all the stories that have made up the history of Ontario. And so if we want to do that, we need to follow through. We need to be present. We need to keep showing up. And if we don't, people will notice. So I think we need to make sure that we are present in many conversations, and that we are following through on anything we committed to.
Thank you. And Lopez, what is at stake for your institution or field when it comes to centering Black political organizing materials and topics?
I think it's the same as what Sean said, you know, goes to credibility. You know, we've always sort of been an archive that has centered the mosaic of the Black experience, and that is an integral part of it. And so if we're not documenting, if we're not preserving, and if we're not telling that part of the story, then we're really not telling the totality of the Black experience. And so it's basically integral to the work that we do, that we maintain and preserve and make available these histories and these stories. You know, it's because it is so integral to the Black experience that it's almost like it would be impossible to tell a true story without that piece.
Melissa, your thoughts?
Just to add what Lopez said, if you know the Black records and the history of Black political organizing isn't acknowledged and centered, that does add to the larger erasure of our history in Canada and America. That adds to the ignorance that is widespread in our country. So I think that is a huge issue as well. It's really important for archival institutions to center Black records and the experiences of Black people, for scholarship, for education, for us to actually understand Black people in this country, our experiences in this country and in America. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. So what are the challenges that your institution or field faces when trying to advance conversations and initiatives around Black women's political activism, organizing, and institution building? What are the specific challenges that are faced in that endeavor? Melissa.
I'm not sure if I've been in the field long enough to truly speak to this question.
Okay.
Could you come back to me after? Maybe I could add to what they say.
I certainly can. I'm going to go to the man with 20 years of experience. So that's Shawn. So what are the challenges that your institution or field faces, Shawn, when trying to advance conversations and initiatives around Black women's political activism, organizing, and institution building?
Well, the pandemic is certainly a significant challenge. It's hard to follow through on relationship building when you can't see people face to face, other than on a screen. But I think we're all dealing with that. I think it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, and that's just the getting to know the field a little bit more. I mean, just getting to understand the nuances of Black activism, of who is involved, who are the players, what the interests are, and that, as I've said before, is just about not shying away from potentially difficult conversations, but reaching out to people and just seeing if there's a way that we can get to understand how we can be supporting communities. So in Toronto, we have Black Lives Matter Canada and the Wild Seed Center, which is an artist-run center here in Toronto for Black arts and activism. They were recently granted funding to build an archive. So I'll be meeting with them on Monday. And again, it's no expectations, no preconceived notions. It's just trying to figure out what their interest is in building archives. What can we share? How can we support that in terms of any knowledge or expertise we may have? Is any of it useful? We're willing to share that. Is there a way that we can be working together in sort of a collaborative acquisition sort of way? Can we sort of work with the organization to sort of identify those groups of records that might be provincially significant and which they might feel would be better placed at the Archives of Ontario? So these are just conversations and things that we'll figure out. Again, supporting projects that are already underway, and just seeing how we can be a part of that. So they're all challenges, of course, time, resources, understanding, all that stuff. But I think of them more as opportunities to get to know something that I didn't before, and just to become better humans.
Lopez, what are the challenges that your institution or field faces when trying to advance conversations and initiatives around Black women's political activism, organizing, and institution building?
I think probably the biggest challenge would be maintaining that focus. There's a lot of attention to Black history now, and it's very specific on specific topics, specific organizations, specific stories. So much is placed, so much focus, particularly because of what has happened over the last year with Black Lives Matter and the protests and the focus on anti-racism. And so there are a lot of competing interests. And so balancing what stories gets told in the capacity that you have to tell them is probably the biggest challenge, ensuring that in the list of everyone's interests, it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. That's probably the biggest, I would say, challenge in the field right now, because there's a lot of interest in telling certain stories and who's funding certain projects, what is getting the most attention. And sometimes the funding becomes the driver of what gets done. And so then that becomes, okay, well, is that kind of cutting off certain stories because those with the funding want to tell this story? And then it pushes back those other stories that are equally as important, but they don't have the big funders behind them to tell those stories. And so that's something that, is a challenge, and it's something that's kind of been in the back of my mind, particularly watching what has happened over the last 18 months. And so while there's a lot of people coming into the Black history, Black storytelling space, and there's sometimes driving the story as opposed to those who've kind of always been there telling the story. And so what is the effect of that? And so I think that is probably the biggest challenge that I see right now.
Okay, just a reminder, sorry, focus, absolutely. And that equitable distribution of focus, right?
Yeah.
It's true. It's true. Sometimes the dollars speak or cause us to speak in certain ways and to shine our lights on certain things. Melissa, your opportunity to add anything to these comments?
I just wanted to say I really appreciated Lupa's comment. And just to add that I believe he's referring to how some records have been tokenized, how Black stories are being amplified perhaps in a performative way in some instances, right? And so, yes, this is something that needs to be ongoing. It's not just something that people should be hopping on as a trend now because this is a current conversation. This is something that, Black history matters. It's a part of Canadian history, it's part of American history, and it shouldn't be tokenized. It should be meaningfully recognized, just like white history.
Very good. Thank you. So we're going to go to the audience Q&A now, and there are some great questions that have popped up in the chat. Lauren, do you want to get started? I know there was something that Kirsten posted quite a while ago. So if you want to scroll up to that, sorry, Kirsten, I'd love to hear these wonderful questions.
Absolutely. Thank you. So Kirsten Lee, she spoke yesterday presenting a paper. She asks, it strikes me that many Black memory workers aren't employed as archivists, curators, etc., and are unfortunately at many institutions unlikely to ever be so. Do you all have any thoughts about how the profession shapes what we call the archive?
I can speak to this briefly. I think the first issue is that to work in an archive, to be employed as an archivist, you have to go study library information studies, which is, these programs are largely so steeped in white supremacy that they're not spaces or programs that feel safe or, created for Black people. And if Black people go into archives with an interest of preserving Black records, you're going to learn traditional theories and practices that are not created for Black records. So I think for some Black people that want to be archivists, they get into archival work outside of the archive field, but then that's not legitimized because they didn't get an LIS degree. So I think that is the root of the issue there, is how info science has been institutionalized, and that's the only thing that's truly seen as legitimate for archival institutions to hire Black memory workers.
And I guess just to kind of piggyback off that, I will say that the field itself has not always been welcoming to Black memory workers. It has been a pretty, it can be debilitating to some people. I know that we have had, being who we are, we sometimes see information science students come to us for support. They're not Howard students, but they come to us for support from other institutions because they don't get that support at their home institution. So they come to us for affirmation and come to us for support. And we do provide that. And it's unfortunate that they're not getting that support at their home institutions. But, that's kind of the space that we've carved in. And then you also have to remember that the field is not the most well-funded. And so they don't pay. Depending on where you are, you're not being paid as well as you probably feel you should have. And so sometimes you're just priced out. I just can't afford to do the work. I would love to do the work, but I just can't afford to stay there because it's not going to pay, what I need to pay. And, and that's just being real, you can't take a vow of poverty, just to do the work. And so, that's just sometimes the reality of the field.
Can I just add to that? It also just brought to mind how I think what a lot of Black memory workers and Black scholars who want to be archivists do think of as well is that most archives are predominantly white institutions. So that means you will likely spend most of your career processing records that doesn't speak to what you would like to prioritize as well because of various reasons, because of the way the institution functions, right? So In Canada, I see more Black scholars working outside of archives because that is how they can do the work that they want to do to amplify Black history. You can't really do that from a predominantly white institution. At least that's how a lot of people feel. That is currently how I feel. I think it's changing a bit, but it is more difficult because it's an institution, right? So.
Yeah, and I can certainly appreciate that it's a steep uphill climb to get to a place where the collections we have would be of interest to Black archivists. I mean, if we want to attract Black archivists to our institution, for example, we have to make the work way more interesting. I feel for anybody who comes into our building on an entry level job, because it's a lot of boring work working on things that just aren't that interesting. So I mean, from that perspective, I don't see why anybody would want to enter into the archives. But certainly, if we want to get to a place where more Black archivists are interested in staying in the profession, we have to make sure that the work is there to sustain interest, and that that is respectful and affords opportunities for individuals to work on the projects and to move into the directions that that are important to them.
I also just wanted to add, sorry, that, from my experience working in an archive and speaking to other people of color who've worked in archives, the other issue is that not just that sometimes the records that you work with may not be of interest to you, they could be traumatizing to you. They could affect you psychologically, right? So it can be a lot of emotional labor to work in an archive for some Black people as well, and some people, before they even get an education, they already have that fear that that will be their experience. And so I think the more things slowly start to change, the more there are like Black professors and library and information studies, methodology for working with Black records, archives collecting more Black records, that could change over time. But that is also an issue, that people have a fear of what it will be like to work with the records, or they have difficult experiences working with the records.
It's true. It can be exhausting. It really can be exhausting just doing this work and reading it and seeing the images and the stories. And you're like, oh, goodness, it's draining. Some days it can be draining,
All right, I'm going to go on to the next question. I'm just going to go in order the way they've been coming in. So the next one comes from, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Thaisa Way. She asked, thinking about the importance of land to Shadd Cary, I wonder how archives might think about how they archive relationships to place, practice that are about the land, soil, and place. Does this shape the materials of the archive?
Sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, I'll try to read it a little bit smoother too. Thinking about the importance of land to Shadd Cary, I wonder how archives might think about how they archive relationships to place, practices that are about land, soil, and place. Does this shape the materials of the archive?
Yeah, so I think thinking specifically in terms of Marianne Shadd Cary, her geographical location has dictated where the records have remained. So the records that are now part of the Archives of Ontario were found in a house in Chatham, Ontario, after it was demolished in the 70s. And through the good fortune of somebody noticing the stuff in the rubble, was able to save it. So the physical records were microfilmed and came to the Archives of Ontario, and then the physical records have remained in Chatham, but they will be coming to us for permanent preservation sometime this fall. Other bits are at Library and Archives Canada, and obviously there's material at Howard University as well. So I think the land, based upon her physical proximity to different parcels of the land, have splintered the collection, and in some ways may have limited an understanding of her life as a whole. The great thing, of course, where we are right now is we have this great equalizer, which is the internet and the World Wide Web and Zoom and all these things. So we have a real opportunity for land to be less of an issue in bringing intellectual history of Marianne Shadd Cary together in one place. And I think that'll be something that will be challenging and shouldn't be such a challenge, but it's something that we'll have to think about doing as part of the 200th anniversary of her birth.
And I guess I could say, because I was just kind of thinking about this, the way it shapes collections is sometimes that's where, collections sometimes need to be in the place where they were developed, the place where they happened, just to really tell the story the best way. Like someone mentioned a collection that we felt didn't need to be at our archive. And so we directed them to a local archive. We said, that's a local story. This collection tells a great local story of the people in this community. So it doesn't need to come here to DC. It needs to stay there in that community for the people of that community to have easy access to those records and to that information. And so, we directed them to a local archive there who could not better preserve, but a local archive there who could preserve that history and make it available. And so that's where I really see that coming in, is making sure that things are where they need to be, if that makes sense, at institutions that can really appreciate the records and can really tell that story in relationship to the archive, the community, and their collection.
Okay, I'm going to turn to the next question. Marlis, it sounded like your questions were being answered about how could or in what ways can archives, particularly Black archives, be effective to the public humanities and vice versa. Did anybody want to add on to that? What's already been discussed?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. How could or in what ways can archives, particularly Black archives, be effective to the public humanities and vice versa? And I might add on that to another kind of question is how can the long history of Black archival practice guide or continue to guide and expand the work that we do?
I would say for that piece, I would just say, remember the work that has been done. Remember the people who've done the work. There are people who've been in this field for a long time doing this work. That's why I always uplift Dorothy Porter Wesley, because sometimes she doesn't get the respect that she deserves, or she's used as kind of just lip service. Oh yeah, she did this. It's like, no, you don't really understand the impact of what she did. The fact that she created an entire field of description for the Black experience, when even at her own institution, she faced pushback. That's something that is incredible. Just to me, it's incredible. And so just remembering their work, remembering the examples that they set and their determination, I think really will help as we continue to move forward. And in terms of the public humanities piece, I guess I'll just say that I think that Black archives have always contributed to the public humanities piece because they've always been so public facing. But I think that, it does need to be done in a way that doesn't necessarily marginalize the community archives and the Black archives. Sometimes the work can be done in a space where, oh yes, let's get all this information out of these archives so you don't have to go there, and then the archive itself is marginalized, So I think that that's something that we do need to keep in mind as we move into that space. But that's a different conversation entirely.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, certainly as we evolve and we identify collections that maybe haven't been surfaced before, as we bring in new material, as we develop new relationships, there's opportunities for us to sort of rethink the stories we've been telling for a long time through our online exhibits, for example. There's a certain opportunity for us to sort of center Black experiences and Black histories in many of those stories in a way that wasn't done before. We have opportunities to work with community partners like the Ontario Black History Society, and partners across the province, frankly, that we haven't been in touch with for a long time before. So the Amherstburg Freedom Museum, for example, in sort of rethinking how we describe predominantly Black collections, how we sort of just tell stories differently. I think there's just a great opportunity for us to work with new partners in recentering or in focusing on Black histories in our storytelling.
Okay, the next question, thank you for that. The next question comes from Dadaja Cheko Green. She asks, how can Black archivists get past the structural paradigm where institutional archives are predominantly white and Black archives are rendered community? It reminds her of Hull, Bell, Scott, and Smith, all quote, all the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. The question is, are Black archivists and memory workers organizing to institutionalize our own collections?
I think that we need to support our institutional archives that are Black. And because they do exist, they're just not as kind of, they don't get the attention that other archives get. You know, they don't have the publicity machines to kind of promote themselves and do all of, you know, the public programming that brings attention to them. And so I think that a way to do that is to support the archives at institutions, you know, support Black archives at Black institutions, support Black archives that are with community organizations. And so support these local archives, help them build, help them maintain. You know, it's great to, okay, let me donate something to a large institution so that they can expand the stories that they're telling. But don't forget that there are, you know, our own institutions that have been doing this work. You know, they don't need to go away just because we want to support larger institutions. So I think that that's one of the ways that we can do that, is to support these archives that have been preserving and maintaining these histories, even if they aren't the, you know, the shiniest penny in the drawer. You know, still realize that they are important and that they need to still exist.
Sean or Melissa?
I would say in Canada, most of the Black archives are privately held. It's just, you know, the issue is power and privilege and funding, right? So I know the Ontario Black History Society has a funding campaign to create their own archive and museum and library. I don't know about any other Black institutions that are looking to do so, but that's something that could possibly change within Canada, where we do have our own institutional archive. But currently it's largely privately held. But yeah, it's an issue of power and privilege, and that is why the language kind of reflects that.
Yeah, I think most archives in Canada are institutional archives. There's not the same breadth of diversity amongst archival institutions as there might be in the States. But they are emerging. So, for example, there's the Muslims in Canada archives that's just been developing out of U of T. As I said, the Wild Seed Center is looking at building an archives. The Ontario Black History Society is having discussions about that. So I think the role for us to play in any of those developments is to really think in terms of how we can be supportive, in terms of providing any expertise we might have and providing any know-how we might have. In some cases, and this hasn't been explored yet, maybe deaccessioning collections and placing them in a different location so they can be closer to the people who want to have access to that material. But the one thing that we have been doing, which has been really great, is in working with the Muslims in Canada archives, is we've evolved a model whereby we're in relatively constant conversation. They can call us any point in time to ask us any questions they might have. But we have sort of an understanding that they have an acquisitions mandate, and we support that. So that if donation offers come to us, we defer to MICA. And in the same token, they also receive donation offers, or they become aware of collections of Muslim Ontarians who they may feel are provincially significant and should be placed at the Archives of Ontario, so that we can work together in sort of developing collections, both at the Archives of Ontario and at MICA, that will have the same purpose in the end, and that's to document the lives of Muslims in Ontario and Muslims in Canada where there hasn't been documentation before. So I think that's certainly a way that we can move together in a mutually supportive way to ensure that we're meeting the needs of researchers and communities.
Wonderful, thank you. We are coming up just about to the end of the Q&A session, so I'm going to ask this last question and then turn it back to Irene to close us out. Jim Casey asks, can we ask to hear about how the Shadd archival collections in Ontario NDC? It's thrilling to see the materials digitized for the Moreland Spingarn and to anticipate the ongoing efforts in Ontario. Have any items, themes, or highlights emerged just yet in those collections?
Yeah, so I have not been in the Archives of Ontario for coming up on 19 months now. And we have agreed with Ed and Maxine Robbins in Chatham, Ontario, that it's time for the material to be transferred to the Archives of Ontario. So once we get an opportunity to do that, right now we're looking at November, then we'll start to take a look at that material, start examining whether there's opportunities for practicum placements. The digitization work will evolve from there. The sort of communications plan will flow out, and we'll make sure that community members know about that. But the one thing that's been pretty amazing through this whole process, of course, is, as I said, right now we're speaking amongst ourselves across the continent about looking at working with the material for a meaningful anniversary. But within Ontario as well, it's meant that we've been reaching out to community members in Chatham-Kent to sort of make sure that everybody agrees that the material coming to the Archives of Ontario is the best for the physical material. And just it's giving us an amazing opportunity just to sort of be involved with our own local community as well as the international one that we're amongst right now.
And I'll just say it's been, since we've digitized the collection, it's been great to see that people have been using it. People reach out and say, I've been using that, and they're like, oh, where's more? So now they think we're hiding things, and they're like, no, we're not hiding anything. So I'll be excited to hear when that material is available, Sean, so that we can direct people to you, and they can say, where's the rest? And we can say, go to the Archives of Ontario.
Yeah, it's also brought us into contact with Library and Archives Canada, who have a small collection of Marianne Shadd Cary material as well. So we'll be continuing the conversation with them and ensuring that they're doing their part to digitize and make their material available. And as I said, the idea will be like, let's figure out a way that we can bring it all together in one space, so that people can see the breadth of her life and career as best as they can through the documents.
Yeah, I think the idea of building an aggregator is an awesome opportunity that's presented by the internet, that we can bring these collections together electronically, so you can have one, I don't want to say definitive source, but a fairly comprehensive source.
I don't know about you, but every time I say internet, I feel old. I feel like there's another word I should be using.
Some people say interwebs.
All right, I am going to turn it back to Irene.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here, but especially Lopez Matthews Jr., Sean Smith, Melissa Nelson. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion. And I want to encourage everyone to return for 12 o'clock for our keynote. To tell us more about that, I'm going to invite back Kristen Moriah.
Hi, thank you so much, Irene. And thank you, Lopez, Sean, and Melissa. This is such an invigorating panel again. And I feel as if I've learned so much. I'm re-energized. I'm excited about Archives Ontario opening up again. And I'm looking forward to, getting my hands dirty and doing this work again. At 12 noon, we've got an amazing keynote coming up. It's our second keynote, and that keynote will be delivered by Martha Jones. So please join us again at noon for our keynote. Immediately following the keynote will be a planning session for the upcoming 200th anniversary of Marianne Shadd Cary's birth in 2023. I mean, we're excited to see so many people from different organizations and different constituencies here for this panel, and we hope that you'll join us again as we think about how we can all work together to observe, commemorate, and again, bring attention to Marianne Shadd Cary and the work of women like her. So thank you once again to everyone. Special thanks to Irene Moore-Davis, who just did such an incredible job of moderating this panel. You guys were fantastic.
So one thing I don't like about presenting on Zoom is the end of any session is so anticlimactic.
Yeah.
Something is moving. Please don't get in the way. It's lifting spirits. The poor can feel its power. It's getting closer. This is no time to cower. Everybody. Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Hey, everybody across the world today, justice is calling for us to clear her way. She needs our voices. We need her cleansing hand, and we can do it. It's time to take a stand, everybody. Another world is possible. Another world. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Can you see it? Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Hey, everybody who fears oppressive powers, their time is coming. Their greed will bring them down. History is moving in a different way to a new thing, where all will have a say. Everybody. Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Hey, everybody. Another world is necessary. Yeah. Can you see it? Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Hey, everybody across the world today, say sí se puede, and that means yes we can. And now Harambe, for some unity, let's work together for our equality. Everybody. Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. I'm trying to tell you. Can you see it? Another world is possible. Yeah. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. We got to see it. Can you see it? Another world. Another world is needed here right now, right now. And we got to have it. Another world is possible. Another world is needed. We got to have it. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it?
Lift every voice, voice. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let all rejoice Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with the steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed.
We have come over a way that the tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of a bright star is cast. God of our wearies, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light. Keep us forever in the path we lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand true to our God, true to our God, and true to our land. We're gonna stay true till the victory is won. We're gonna win it every time. Gotta keep marching. You gotta keep marching. You gotta keep marching till the Something is moving. Please don't get in the way. It's lifting spirits. The poor can feel its power. It's getting closer. This is no time to cower. Everybody. Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Hey, everybody across the world today, justice is calling for us to clear her way. She needs our voices. We need her cleansing hand, and we can do it. It's time to take a stand. Everybody. Another world is possible. Another world. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Can you see it? Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Hey, everybody who fears oppressive powers, their time is coming. Their greed will bring them down. History is moving in a different way to a new thing, where all will have a say. Everybody. Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Hey, everybody. Another world is necessary. Yeah. Can you see it? Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Hey, everybody across the world today, say sí se puede, and that means yes we can. And now Harambe, for some unity, let's work together for our equality. Everybody. Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. I'm trying to tell you. Can you see it? Another world is possible. Yeah. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. We got to see it. Can you see it? Another world. Another world is needed. Is needed here right now, right now. And we got to have it. Another world is possible. Another world is needed. We got to have it. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it? Another world is possible. Another world is needed. Another world is necessary. Can you see it?
Lift every voice, voice. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let all rejoicing into the light. Keep us forever in the path we Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand true to our God, true to our God, and true to our land. We're gonna stay true till the victory is won. We're gonna win it every time. Gotta keep marching. You gotta keep marching. You gotta keep marching till the victory is won. Lift every voice, voice.
Oh, Martha and Brandy, one thing we didn't know is that everybody's automatically muted. So if you have
Lift every voice, voice. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let all rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound.
Kevin, let us know when we're broadcasting.
Rolling sea. Sing
Okay, start letting people in.
full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought.
Welcome back, everyone. We're going to go ahead and take a moment to let more people into the room, and then we'll begin. So go ahead and get comfy. We'll see you in a moment. All right, so welcome back, guys, and thank you so much for joining us for the remaining session of the Marianne Shadd Cary in the Here and Now Symposium. We're going to go ahead and start off with a reminder of our code of conduct. In accordance with the Center for Black Digital Research's principles, our code of conduct allows CBDR to create the best experience possible for all attendees. We are dedicated to providing a harassment-free environment for everyone, regardless of gender identity and expression, age, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, or religion or lack thereof. We do not tolerate harassment of participants in any form. Sexual language and violent imagery is not appropriate during any aspect of this virtual event or conference, including talks, workshops, parties, social media such as Twitter or other online media. Thanks, guys. So it is my privilege and honor to introduce our speaker. I want to remind folks that after her talk, we will go ahead and do Q&A. So please drop your questions and comments in the chat. Let me go ahead and say it is such a privilege. It is just an overwhelmingly wonderful moment for me to go ahead and introduce Dr. Martha Jones. Her contributions to the field of African-American women's history has indelibly shaped our understanding of our foremothers and in turn how we understand ourselves and our freedom struggles today with democracy in America. Professor Martha S. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Professor Jones is the author of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, published in 2020. It was selected as one of the Times 100 must-read books for that year. Her 2018 book, Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, was winner of the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Award, which is Best Book in Civil Rights History, the American Historical Association Littleton Griswold Prize for Best Book in American Legal History, the American Society of Legal History John Philip Reed Book Award for Best Book in Anglo-American Legal History, and the Baltimore City Historical Society Scholars Honor for 2020. Professor Jones is also author of All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, published in 2007, and co-editor of Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women with UNC Press, published in 2015, as well as numerous articles and essays. Dr. Jones is a public historian, writing for broader audiences at the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, Talking Points Memo, Politico, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and Time. She's an exhibition curator for, quote, Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation at the William L. Clements Library, and an expert consultant for museum, film, and video productions with the Smithsonian's Natural Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, PBS American Experience, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Netflix, and other publications and productions. Recently, Dr. Jones also announced an unprecedented publishing deal for 4 books forthcoming on the subject of race, history, slavery, identity, and more. So I speak for everyone in saying congratulations, welcome, and we're elated to have you today, Dr. Martha Jones.
Thank you so much, Brandy, for that welcome. Before I begin, I want to thank you. I want to thank everyone in front of the camera and behind the scenes at the Center for Black Digital Research. We so often draw upon that metaphor about the shoulders upon which we stand. But I know you all already know that my work, much of it would not be possible without the collaboration, the partnership, the foundation, and more that you all have lain for so many of us. I'm really here in part because of so many of you and the ongoing work that we have done on the life and the legacies of Marianne Shadd Cary. It's an extraordinary honor to be here among so many folks fresh to the subject of Marianne Shadd Cary, along with the opportunity to hear from the extraordinary Jane Rhodes, whose book, Marianne Shadd Cary, The Black Press and Protest in the 19th Century, remains our guide. Published in 1998, what a tribute to a book that it stands that test of time. And still, I think this is my third copy because I keep giving it away and loaning it. And so there it is. But here, for me, when I was a graduate student in the mid-1990s, and I was looking to find my way, frankly, to Black women's history in an academy that really didn't quite yet wholly recognize who we were and what we brought to the table and where we were going. It was books like that of Dr. Rhodes that really served as a kind of beacon for someone like me. So it's an incredible honor to share this program with her and with all of you. So during yesterday's panel, I didn't know that Brandy Locke was going to be introducing me, but I was on the edge of my seat as I listened to her presentation. And I partly was on the edge of my seat because she pointed out something that I hadn't quite crystallized in my mind, but I'm going to try and paraphrase Brandy, and if I've gotten it wrong, you'll come back and tell me how I've gotten it wrong. But part of what I took away from your opening comments was that we were called upon in part to account for a kind of unevenness in the study of Marianne Shadd Cary's life and work. She lives a long life across many epochs in US history. And you rightly, I think, pointed to the way in which we know one Marianne Shadd Cary, and we know her quite well, and she is the pre-Civil War, antebellum, Canada West, provincial freeman Marianne Shadd Cary. But in this life that continues robustly through the Civil War and beyond, in this post-war period, we've studied her less. And that felt like a really critical intervention at a moment like this as we're gearing up to mark 200 years of her life. So my goal today is, in a small way, to try and bridge those histories, if you will, those two Marianne Shadd Carys, trying to link her work on the one hand in the provincial freeman in the 1850s to her years in Washington, D.C. after the Civil War. My focus today is on Shadd Cary and her concerns with law and her contributions as a legal thinker. I want to center on her as an intellectual, as a producer of ideas and more. And I begin with an anecdote. It's now quite a few years ago, probably more than a decade, when someone asked me who had been the first Black woman graduate of the law school where I was teaching at the time, at the University of Michigan Law School. Now, I was a little embarrassed, truthfully, because I didn't know the answer. But the question sort of sent me on a modest quest to learn, in fact, who had been the first Black woman to graduate there. And I headed to the library. It didn't take long. Importantly, historian J. Clay Smith I learned, who had devoted so much of his work to chronicling the history of Black lawyers and lawyering. He had published an interview with her. And so I met Jane Cleo Marshall Lucas in his book, Rebels in Law, Voices in History, in the History of Black Women Lawyers. So Lucas, it turned out, had come to Michigan law after finishing her BA at Howard University in 1940. She'd been a student of Rayford Logan. And by 1942, Lucas was on her way to earning dual graduate degrees at Michigan in law and political science. So I had discovered, hardly, right? She had been there all the time, but for myself, I had discovered Lucas. And I excitedly called my colleague and mentor, Dr. Mary Frances Berry, who herself is a holder of 2 graduate degrees in law and history from Michigan. I wanted to tell her what I'd learned about Lucas. Now, if you've ever had the opportunity to encounter Dr. Berry yourself, you already know that there's not very much you can actually tell her. And so she knew certainly about Lucas, but she listened to me. And then she set me straight. She explained that she knew the story of Lucas, but she warned me to be wary of stories that turned on the notion of Black firsts. Her point was that to celebrate them too emphatically is to cover over the story of those who come before. Now, in our conversation about Lucas, this meant that if I spent too much time heralding, if you will, Lucas as the first graduate, insisting that she be remembered, we might be in danger of overlooking those who had tried, who had attempted, who had strived, who had even failed. That the whole story of Black women at an institution like Michigan Law, but not only at Michigan Law, was one that needed to include the Black women who had aspired, who had aimed, who had attempted the law school, but had not, like Lucas, actually graduated. And when I dug deeper into Lucas's story, I recognized that she herself hinted at this sort of dilemma when she recounted her experience at Michigan Law. And in a moment, an incident, what she described as the only suggestion of prejudice during her years there. It happened nearly the very first day when she showed up to register. And this is Lucas speaking. A middle-aged white lady who was probably the head clerk said to me, "You're not the first colored girl to enter the law school. None of them finished. We'll see what you do." There it was, a slim bit of evidence of that broader story, right? The experiences of those women invoked in the phrase, "none of them." Those were the women that Dr. Berry had insisted were essential companions to Jane Cleo Marshall Lucas, even if they did not march with her at commencement. So as I returned, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity to return once again to Mary Ann Shadd Cary's time and some of the mysteries about her time at Howard Law School, Dr. Berry's insights and the story of Jane Cleo Marshall Lucas stayed with me. Lucas, unlike Shadd Cary, was that Black woman first. She graduated from Michigan Law in 1946. At Howard, Shadd Cary was for a long time, we thought, among the none of them, as in the none who ever finished. So I went back to that interview with Lucas. She had gone on to be the first Black woman to be admitted to the Maryland bar in 1946. Later that year, she joined Howard University's law school as the first woman full-time faculty member. So even as Lucas and Shadd Cary are separated by decades, by epochs even in our history, for me, it's sure that they lived lives that were intertwined by ambition, by institutions, and by the dilemma that has surrounded how a Black woman might secure a legal education, and then what she might do with it. Now, historian James Rhodes has explained that in September of 1869, Mary Ann Shadd Cary joined the first bona fide law class at Howard University Law School. She was the only woman among the 46 members, a class that also included her younger brother, Abraham Shadd. She was the first woman to enroll, and it was a formidable undertaking. Shadd Cary kept up her work as a teacher and principal during the day while taking law classes at night. She lived on campus, took part in evening study groups while caring for 2 children. Rhodes found evidence of Shadd Cary's performance in a July 1870 presentation in which a reporter praised her clear, incisive analysis of one of the most delicate legal questions. The subject matter was the origin and necessity of corporations. And that I made a note of something to think more about. But if Shadd Cary appeared to excel, Rhodes didn't find evidence that she completed her studies immediately there at Howard. When the law school held its first commencement in February 1871, Mary Ann Shadd Cary was not among the 10 graduates, though her brother Abraham was. And as Rhodes explains, the why of Shadd Cary's failure to complete her law studies then has been the subject of some puzzlement among historians. This group, I know, knows that the longer story of how Shadd Cary returned to Howard in the 1880s, though whether it was to complete her studies or for the formality of having her degree confirmed is frankly still unclear to me. But we do know that by the 1880s, she adds Esquire to her name, and this becomes part of her professional identity. And as best I can tell, this remains a contested part of her history. Do a survey of writings about Shadd Cary, both scholarly and popular, and you will find varying versions of this story. And I'd be interested to hear today from anybody, or at any time from anybody who might want to tell me how they've puzzled through that question. But that's not quite my purpose today. I don't want to revisit that turn of events. Instead, I want to offer another view, I hope a broader view of the story of Mary Ann Shadd and her Shadd Cary and her early time at Howard Law School. And I want to suggest that when we constrain that story to a framework of firsts, when we reduce it to a matter of whether she did or did not graduate, we actually miss an opportunity to explore what I think is an important thread in her life as a thinker, that of her thinking about the Constitution. So let's go back and set Shadd Cary's legal training in some, I think, useful context. When we imagine her, I think, embarking on legal training there in the 1860s, as she entered Howard Law, I think oftentimes our imaginations comport with 21st century sensibilities about how Americans get to the bar, how they practice. And so it's worthwhile to recall that at the middle of the 19th century, that was only one and hardly the most common route to becoming a lawyer. Prior to 1870 and really through to the 1890s, when Shadd Cary entered Howard Law, most legal practitioners gained their training not by formal schooling at all, but instead by way of a tutorial relationship during which they privately read, and this is a term of art, they read law under the guidance of an experienced practitioner. The goal was to gain a sufficient understanding of law and then to evidence that before a judge who examined the candidate and then ruled on their admission to the bar. Law school training was an alternative route, but not the one that most American lawyers had taken by the 1860s. Rather than attending law school or a degree program, especially for Black lawyers who were barred from American law schools for much of the early 19th century, there has to be another route. And we don't have to look far from Mary Ann Shadd Cary's circle to discern that, because Howard Law School's founding dean, John Mercer Langston, from Ohio, after he finishes his MA in theology at Oberlin, read law with Philemon Bliss, an abolitionist and member of Congress. This was a wholly voluntary arrangement. Bliss accepted to tutor Langston independent of any structure or requirement that he do so, independent of any educational institution. The two succeeded, and Langston was examined and admitted to the Ohio bar in 1854. And the quality of their work together mattered, as did Bliss's reputation, which furthered Langston's effort and his standing before the judge who admitted him. Now, Langston's story is exceptional in some ways. He's the first Black American to be admitted to the bar in Ohio, but it was a rather ordinary course, this reading of law with an expert that got him there. Still, Bliss's office wasn't the only place that John Mercer Langston had studied law. He, like many Black men of his generation, had been part of the colored convention movement, where understanding law, especially the US Constitution, was a central concern. As early as 1851, Black men in Ohio were not only coming together, they were publishing pamphlets through which they instructed one another in the terms and the meanings terms and the means for amending their state constitution. They, for example, addressed a state constitutional convention that year on how it might, or maybe better put, how it should amend the state's governing text by striking out the word white so that Black men would be permitted to cast ballots in Ohio. The pamphlet was more than an instrument of advocacy. It was surely that, but it was also a learned text approximating a legal treatise on the matter of equality before the law. It's an impressive document. In the colored conventions, it had been true from the outset that Black men came together from New England, the mid-Atlantic, as far south as Virginia, to discuss the rise of Black laws, the prospect of leaving the US. They studied the Constitution, teaching themselves how to comprehend and then wield it in the interests of their rights. As far back as the inaugural convention in 1830, among the delegates were men from Ohio who that early were being driven out of their state by discriminatory Black laws. One member of that convention, Hezekiah Grice, came home to Baltimore with that dilemma in mind, and he organized the Legal Rights Association in Baltimore, aiming to prove that Black Americans were citizens before the US Constitution. His partner was William Watkins, an educator and commentator in the anti-slavery press. And they wrote about the Constitution as a companion to the Declaration of Independence, as obliged to the Declaration's ideals and its promise to all men born free, guaranteed certain rights, inalienable rights. Watkins wrote, "The Declaration of Independence is our advocate, and we hope it will yet be ascertained whether or not the Constitution secures to us those rights which the Declaration so freely accords." So here we are, even before someone like Mary Ann Shadd Cary enters the public realm, a tradition of studying, understanding, teaching the Constitution has been generated and is being practiced in the colored conventions. And here enter Mary Ann Shadd Cary and her provincial freemen in the 1850s. Hadn't she been already studying law to the degree she'd been tuning into these conventions? Hadn't she indeed been studying law for a very long time before she actually enrolls at Howard Law School? Hadn't she not only been a student of the Constitution, hadn't she provided on the pages of the provincial freemen a means for reading law for many Black Americans for whom the doors of law offices and law schools remained shut? Now, it won't surprise many of you that I've spent a lot of time with the provincial freemen, and it is in some ways styled as a kind of open forum. But I think today we know the extraordinary influence, the hand of Mary Ann Shadd Cary, and how it is shaping what makes it into print in the provincial freemen. Here, she is someone who is curating and offering up a series of lessons in my work, important lessons on the history of women's rights, and particularly women's votes, and the questions that swirl through those possibilities at the middle of the 19th century. But it turns out thinking about constitutions was as fundamental as we're thinking about women's rights on the page of the Provincial Freeman. Read the opening prospectus of the Provincial Freeman, and you will see how constitutional thinking fits. There she is in Canada West in the 1850s. She's discerned in the British constitutional framework a set of principles that look to sideline, in her view, anti-Black racism, to open the door to full citizenship. The founding prospectus advises readers that the paper has reserved the right to express emphatic condemnation of all projects having for their object, in a great or remote degree, the subversion of the principles of the British Constitution. A view about law, vigilant, critical, purposeful, sat at the foundation of Shadd Cary's bold undertaking in the Provincial Freeman. And readers were on notice, in a sense, that they needed to study up. She was going to help them. And even as she premised her work on the Provincial Freeman and the liberties guaranteed to her in Canada West, Shadd Cary never, as we know, wholly diverted her gaze from struggles in the US. Among the critical issues of the mid-1850s, the years during which she was at work as publisher, consequential debates were roiling in the US about slavery's future, about the possibility of its demise, about the standing of formerly enslaved people, of free Black Americans. Many of these turned on the US Constitution, and Shadd Cary walked readers through that document, training their minds in how law, along with political and moral philosophy, might determine their interests and even their fates. For example, was the Constitution a pro or an anti-slavery text? This was a longstanding debate among US abolitionists. It had splintered alliances among activists, most infamously between Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, who differently regarded the Constitution. Was it a covenant with slaveholders, or was it a promise of a more perfect and free soil nation? From the Provincial Freeman, readers learned not only how some abolitionists, but how some of slavery's most staunch supporters viewed the Constitution as safeguarding the institution of slavery, especially as a matter of property interests. And politics derived directly from this view of the Constitution. She introduces Franklin Pierce, newly elected president in 1854. I believe that involuntary servitude as it exists in different states of this confederacy is recognized by the Constitution. I believe that it stands like any other admitted right, and that the states where it exists are entitled to efficient remedies to enforce the constitutional provision. Southern planters, Shadd Cary revealed, believed much the same. Slaveholding was a constitutionally derived right. The master, when his right is questioned, is to answer that he holds his work people as property under the Constitution. So here, readers discovered that while the US Constitution never expressly addressed slavery, indeed never used the word slave or slavery in its text, it was a document whose provisions, such as the 3/5 clause, the prohibition against interfering with the slave trade, and the power to put down domestic insurrections, these provisions were all understood to buttress, to rationalize, to justify enslavement in the minds of some abolitionists, and certainly in the minds of many of slavery's proponents. What about anti-slavery? Well, it's essential for readers of the Provincial Freeman to learn the lesson in the vagaries of constitutional interpretation. What happens when such a text runs afoul of natural law principles, such as those set forth in the Declaration of Independence? Wasn't there an inherent contradiction between the Constitution's commitments to liberty, to due process, and its use as a pro-slavery instrument? These were questions that readers discovered the provincial freemen were live, prominent, and they discovered how learned and even powerful figures were debating them. For example, they met Henry Ward Beecher, the minister and reformer, who looked to resolve these tensions in the Constitution and threatened that the nation couldn't persist with them intact. It's utterly impossible for slavery and liberty to exist under the same Constitution without conflicts and agitations. Now, Beecher doesn't know that civil war is on the horizon, but he understands the ways in which the Constitution, right, has created a set of contradictions that must be resolved. Abolitionist William Goodell's book, The American Jubilee, was quoted in the Provincial Freeman. The Constitution of the US was an anti-slavery document, Goodell urged. That is, it was a document that can and should be mobilized, amended, and wielded to defeat slavery and restore the nation to the best of its founding ideals. The Provincial Freemen, not surprisingly, I don't think, followed the colored conventions and demonstrated for readers how the Constitution was being interpreted and promoted there. An 1855 meeting was typical and pressing on an anti-slavery view of the text. No person shall be deprived of liberty without due process of law. This is an invocation of the US Constitution. This was a principle that even pro-slavery thinkers revered. So how could it be then that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document when enslavement itself was the deprivation of liberty without cause or process? Black Americans, the conventions urged and the Provincial Freemen amplified, must resist on this point. And men in Ohio in convention reject the notion that slavery is a national institution, one that the Constitution recognizes wherever it goes. This is not a great slave empire. Is the convention's conclusion. So here, to interpret the Constitution was to make a powerful claim about the nature of the nation itself. History mattered for understanding the Constitution, and the Provincial Freeman provides lessons in historical thinking about the origins of the Constitution and its terms, about its framers. Hadn't there been discussion, even in the months spent drafting the 1787 Constitution, that were clearly anti-slavery in their sensibilities? Shouldn't James Madison's reluctance to use the word slave in the Constitution be read as evidence of the document's anti-slavery subtext, if not intent? These are the kinds of debates that are animating constitutional interpretation in the 1850s, but it's important to say they are the kinds of debates that continue to animate constitutional interpretation today. And so this approach that we sometimes refer to as originalism, Shadd Cary is teaching the readers of the Provincial Freeman. So study of the Constitution in the 1850s requires nuanced thinking about the principle of federalism. Now, this is where people's eyes glaze over, I'm sure, but I'm going to insist because Shadd Cary insisted that we understand the ways in which the principle of federalism and the way in which it bifurcated, it divided, it allocated the power of law and governance in the United States was one of the significant hurdles to tackling the question and the project of slavery's abolition. Federalism recognized this dualism, and the Constitution sought to allocate zones of jurisdiction. For example, federal authorities had exclusive power over foreign relations, war, and immigration, while the Constitution left to individual states governance of civil institutions, of criminal law, and even of voting rights. This structure, readers of the Provincial Freeman learned, had profound consequences for slavery and Black life. It produced a nation in which Black Americans fared unevenly, dependent upon where they were born or found themselves, who should determine the legality of slavery in any given state. And what about US territories that sought to enter the Union? How should the status of Black people there be determined? Did Congress have any authority at all to regulate slavery, or was it wholly a so-called domestic institution governed by the states? Provincial Freeman readers learned that in California, for example, the matter of whether that state would permit slaveholding was actually the subject of a debate that turned in part on a constitutional puzzle, this puzzle of federalism. When Indiana looked to regulate the lives of free people of color, was that permissible in light of a federal constitution that guaranteed to all citizens the same privileges and immunities? Article 13 of the Constitution of Indiana prohibited so-called colored people from settling in the state, Shadd Cary reported. And then she quipped, "We thought the Constitution of the United States guaranteed the citizens of one state all the rights and privileges of the citizens of every other state. Not so, it seemed, for Black Americans." So from the founding, readers learned that Black Americans had been couching their claims to equality in constitutional terms. And Shadd Cary set their struggles of the 1850s in that long and important history. Now, there are a couple of extraordinary moments where constitutional thinking is essential for readers of the Provincial Freeman in the 1850s. The first is in thinking through and understanding and grappling with the aftermath of the Fugitive Slave Law. So here, federal officials have now vested private parties, northern officials, and more in the project of slaveholders' capture of so-called fugitives. Does the Constitution provide a remedy, one that would invalidate this law that has come out of Congress? Search the pages of the Provincial Freeman, and Shadd Cary there offers up sometimes glimmers of hope, pronouncements that declare the Fugitive Slave Law unconstitutional, but just as often she provides examples of legal authorities, including US courts in places like Cincinnati, who remand fugitives Black to enslavement by the very terms of this federal law. The cruelty of the law's enforcement was equally offensive as a constitutional matter. The Provincial Freeman reported on a Kentucky case emphatically. Is here contained a free Negro, a man endowed by the Constitution of the United States with all the blessings which may be derived from liberty and the free pursuit of happiness. For the mere crime of living in Kentucky, he must be arrested, thrust into jail, and a most diabolical attempt made to send him to the penitentiary. Yes, this was a moral question, a political question, but it was also a constitutional question as part of what Shadd Cary came to teach in the pages of the Provincial Freeman. The other major matter of the 1850s is the Dred Scott case. And the Provincial Freeman follows that case long before, in 1857, the Supreme Court issues its final ruling. But here, I want to remind us that part of what we need to discern and to puzzle through in order to understand the implications of Dred Scott is the problem of federalism. So Shadd Cary had been preparing her readers for the complexities of Dred Scott, because while we remember that decision importantly and significantly for its declaration that no Black person, enslaved or free, can be a citizen of the United States, this was also a decision that invalidated acts of Congress that had regulated slavery in US territories. It troubled the federalism's arrangement by, in essence, invalidating the authority of Congress to regulate slavery in federal territories. That was to be left now to the new states to determine for themselves as they entered the Union. So here, readers learn the degree to which the Constitution had seemingly granted Congress sovereign power over the territories and then had snatched it back by way of a Supreme Court decision that invalidated that authority. Here, Dred Scott is not simply a betrayal of the interests and the concerns of Black Americans. It is a betrayal of the Constitution itself. And this interpretation, one that Shadd Cary teaches to her readers, is a view that will take them not simply through the 1850s, but on through to Reconstruction. As in the wake of the Civil War, the Constitution will be amended by way of the Revolution of Reconstruction. It is necessary to appreciate those contours of Dred Scott, to then weigh in on the significance, particularly of the 14th and the 15th Amendments, and how they reorder that relationship between the states and the federal government in the wake of the Civil War's revolution. So where is Marianne Shadd Cary in this? She is an interesting thinker in this moment, because as I see it, as someone who is a proponent in these years of emigration, her position is a complicated one, which is to say, her position is one that exploits these narrow readings of the Constitution, these pro-slavery readings of the Constitution, these betrayals of the principles of the Declaration in the Constitution. She's someone who, yes, is a critic of those on the one hand, but the real crux for Shadd Cary goes something like, when are Black Americans in the United States going to realize, to wake up, to recognize the ways in which the weight of constitutional interpretation, the power of those like the US Supreme Court who are interpreting the Constitution and more are working increasingly against them. And this is, while lamentable, precisely the kind of fuel, the kind of ammunition that Shadd Cary trades in to promote, to continue to promote emigration. She writes at one point, "We shall wait with patience to see what it will do for them. We hope, however, that they too will look at facts instead of everlastingly theorizing." Who are the they? It is Black Americans who continue to have a faith in the US Constitution. It is Shadd Cary says that is a false faith, that is a false hope, and folks should come over to the project of emigration if they understand the US Constitution. That conclusion is irresistible. So in my last few minutes, I want to do that thing I promised I would do, which is to try and bridge this story of the antebellum Marianne Shadd Cary with the Marianne Shadd Cary of the post-Civil War period. Yes, she enrolls at Howard Law School. But I want to suggest to us, it's a mistake to think that her legal acumen, her insights into the US Constitution, its promise, its possibilities, its malleability, and more cannot be wholly ascribed to her brief stint at Howard Law, especially when we appreciate that she is going to bring her legal acumen to an issue and a question that is hardly on the front burner at Howard, and that is the issue of women's suffrage. Marianne Shadd Cary, when she comes to the debate over women's voting rights, yes, brings with her, again, a set of moral and philosophical principles, but she also brings keen insight into the Constitution. And here, many of us have read, I'm sure, but I'll share again her remarks before a federal judiciary committee in the 1870s, comments that are aimed at winning a revision to the existing laws of the District of Columbia. Here, she urges that Congress amend the law to excise, to remove the word male from the laws that govern voting rights in the district without delay. There's Marianne Shadd Cary, emphatic as always. She is leading now this movement to to an important degree, set their sights on Congress as the body that will ultimately realize women's voting rights in the United States. And she frames the existing terms of the law in the district as discrimination against women. Women should vote as men do before being further taxed. And here she urges this is an opportunity for Congress to govern the district and to permit the district to be governed by its residents, by its citizens, by their own consent, invoking the principles of the founders that she had so importantly introduced to readers of the provincial Freeman. So I'll end just by saying that thank you, first of all, for this opportunity for me to revisit Marianne Shadd Cary and her thinking, and to appreciate that while there is more to learn, I take it, about the question of her time at Howard Law School, her status as a first or not a first. More importantly, in my view, we have this opportunity to attend to her ideas, to not only appreciate her evolving thinking about the Constitution, but the role she plays in permitting Black Americans to be very much a part of those early debates and prepared, frankly, for the critical debates that will characterize the 1860s and beyond. I'm indebted very much here to you all, to the Colored Conventions Project, to the Center for Black Digital Research. I want to shout out my colleagues from the Black Women's Intellectual and Cultural History Collective, which who some years ago now really instilled in me this imperative that we think about women like Marianne Shadd Cary as thinkers as well as doers. And I'm going to say thank you again to Brandy Locke, who I think is going to join me for conversation and questions. And thank you again so much, Brandy, for sharing this time with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. I think I speak for everyone when I say your talk was incredible. And it's thrilling to see this sort of simmering, underlining conversation about Marianne Shadd Cary as a legal thinker be really lifted up to the surface as this through line that all of us are subtly grappling with in all of the arenas she's working with. So we do have some questions that seek to connect the various interests of our participants today with your expertise and thoughts there. So I'd like to begin with a question that I'm going to rephrase a little bit from Errol Henderson, which is a question about to what extent do we see Marianne Shadd Cary in particular, but perhaps we can speak also to over the course of her life as it applies here, the relationship between the Black feminist ideals, the place and presence of Black women in organizing and in Black, and in particular Black nationalist projects across her lifetime, as it pertains or connects to her legal thought and her and her peers working through that space of or zone of exploration around where do Black women fit, where can we fit based on the Constitution, where do we situate ourselves or reinterpret things?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I have two thoughts. The first is that I think it's important to appreciate the degree to which Shadd Cary, as distinct as she is in many ways, is the inheritor already, certainly by the 1850s, of a political tradition, of a set of ideas, of a political critique, and more that we associate with Black feminist thought. That is to say, she is, a daughter of Maria Stewart. She is a daughter of Sarah Mapps Douglas. She is already, right, standing on the shoulders of Black women who, in oftentimes less overtly or obviously political realms, like literary societies, like churches and more, have been already hammering out a political critique that we come to call intersectionality by the end of the 20th century. She is an inheritor of that. And so I think that's one piece that if we dwell too long, right, on her singularity, we might miss the ways in which she is inheriting a great deal. That's one view. The other thing I'd say is that I think that my view is maybe different than some, is that I see Shadd Cary is much more connected to, with intentionality and with purpose in her own ways, to other Black women activists, to her peers. And Frances Ellen Watkins Harper comes to mind for me. She should come to mind for everybody, if I could put it that way, here. And it was only recently, that I went back to look at how she reported on, how she covered, how she commented on Frances Harper in the 1850s. And she's not only an admirer of Harper, she really lauds Harper as someone with a style and with a way that is very different than that of Shadd Cary. She really respects Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. They share mentors, men like William Still. And so I think she's more connected, I think, to that story than we've sometimes given her credit for. And of course, these are women who are laying the foundation, if you will, for what becomes, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Shadd Cary herself is going to pass away just nearly on the eve of that organization's founding. But I think she's very much a part of that story, rather than someone who is sort of exceptional, stands outside of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say that in that same speech to the Judicial Committee in DC, there's this moment that I had a momentary literary student sort of, nerd moment where I was like, oh my gosh, she is a brilliant legal scholar and, also very aware of how to work a room when she's talking about the Constitution, and she's reminding folks about the history of the building of this country as being through the labor of Black women. She's evoking this Black woman's body, and she's standing in front of them as a Black woman. And it's like, you cannot escape this. We're part of this. We're stitched into this material. And, that to me spells just a fantastic legal mind that I'm glad we're having this conversation about. So thank you. And I want to go ahead and read a question from RJ Boutel. He says, Dr. Jones's description of Black lawyers relying on alternative methods of training outside law schools and the Bar Association have me thinking about our panelists' remarks this morning about how Black archival and memory workers have often labored outside formal institutions because of the limitations and prejudices that structure those institutions. it feels important to continue thinking about the risks and rewards of working within institutions as we look ahead to 2023. And so I'm wondering if you would like to go ahead and comment about, the legal institutions that are also, contextualizing and framing her development as a thinker and determining her legal actions or lack thereof.
Yeah, I appreciate that analogy so much, because I think there is in a way, I think, in Marianne Shadd Cary, right, a brand of strength, a brand of capacity that is very much born, right, of being an outsider, right, and being on the margins. And I think I feel like I have to be careful with that, right, because I wouldn't want that take to fuel the sense that there was something laudable, right, about that exclusion. But at the same time, I think that her capacity for creative, right, unorthodox, cutting edge thinking about many questions, right, is in part a function of, the deep assumption, right, that she is going to occupy a kind of margins always, right? I mean, think about it from the beginning, the first time she sets on the public stage, it's never clear to me, right, whether, it's sort of her forays and her challenges to male leaders come first, or, they've already got those critiques in their pocket, right? I mean, they haven't invented them for her. And so I think that how that might sort of inform our work in 2023 is thinking about sort of not only who we convene, but where we convene, and by what terms we convene. So on the one hand, we continue to benefit from, I think, the cutting edge, the unorthodox, and more, and help let those folks help us. Those of us who are deeply institutionalized, wherever we put down our shovel, like we're deeply institutionalized, and so I think that's a challenge, but I think it's a worthy one to take on. And aren't there still, right, the Marianne Shadd Carys among us, very much so. Who help those of us, who work in much more conventional ways to do our best work, or our better work, at least.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Let's see what else, what other questions we have. All right. What can we learn about working within and outside of institutions from Shadd Cary's writing experience? But more importantly, what challenges persist? And what are some openings and opportunities that you see in terms of future Shadd Cary writings and experiences? So if you had the opportunity, let's say, to take today's talk and turn it into a lecture series, or something that a grad student like myself would sign up for in a heartbeat, what would that look like? Or other areas in terms of her history and her story that you'd like to see expanded?
So two things I want to say. One is, and it connects to the prior question too, we know well the story of Shadd Cary's struggles around editorship of the Provincial Freeman, and how even stepping into her own right newspaper space means she stepped into, right, a world, right, of publishing, of the press, of newspapers, and she is compromised, right? She wrestles with the compromise, right, of what it means, and how, if at all, she's going to show readers that there is a woman at the helm of that. So I think that she provides some, cautionary tales, maybe, about what happens, right, when we build, when we do. I'm sure there's conversations behind the scenes there with you all, right, in your work about what it means to do the work. But for me, if I were free, and some days I'm more free than others, but if I were free, I think I would take a strong lesson from your keynote yesterday about the way in which I participate in this bifurcation, in this distance between African American history and Afro-Canadian history, for example. And I think that one of the things we could do in a seminar, right, would be to further wrestle with that and to theorize that and to make that a part of the way in which we tell this story. In my talk, I don't spend any time on the notion of a British Constitution, which is not a text at all. It's a common law principle, and that is an artifact, right, of my bifurcated way of thinking about North America that imagines I don't have to dwell very long on and explain to you all what it is, we mean differently when we say the British Constitution versus the US Constitution. So I think we could spend time on that. And I do think that, and one of the things I tried to do in Vanguard was to really think about generationally about this story. And so I think that today, if I were to teach Shadd Cary, there would be an important question about the arc of her life, right? And it is an extraordinary arc when we recognize that she lives until the 1890s. And that is the tension, isn't it, between, or I'll say for me, that is the tension between sort of biographically driven histories and histories that take their sensibilities and their frameworks from social and political history. So how do we, on the one hand, continue to build this sort of biographical, right, interpretation of Shadd Cary on the one hand, but how do we use that to embed her in social and political histories in ways that she no longer is simply exceptionalized as an individual, and she becomes an essential companion to a Frederick Douglass or a Martin Delany. We're not there at all. And I think it would be wonderful to explore how to use biography better to get her there.
Absolutely. I totally, thank you. Thank you. I want to go ahead and pose a question from Dr. Foreman. We have a few more questions left. Dr. Foreman writes, I'm always taken by Mary Ann Shadd Cary's much younger brother Abraham's graduation from law school, his move south, his run for office in Mississippi, and his work with early Judge Mifflin Gibbs in Arkansas. Can you talk about gendered circuits of legal development and access in the postbellum era?
Right. I mean, so thank you for that, Dr. Foreman. And did you want to jump in, Dr. Foreman?
I just wanted to say that Juwan Wu also brought up Isaac, right? Her brother who does run in Mississippi and becomes a state legislature. So just to amplify the question more.
Yeah, so thank you. You know, this is the, this moment in the early 1870s is one that I think, so this is just me kind of, as we do, kind of imagining, speculating, right? But I think it's a fascinating coincidence, right? That Shadd Cary kind of falls out, right, of the formal law study right at the moment that the US Supreme Court is going to tell American women generally, right, that there is no right to be admitted to the bar. And the Constitution does not guarantee women any right to be lawyers at all. And the timing feels important for understanding Shadd Cary, even as the folks who are bringing that litigation are not concerned at all with Black women and the distinct impediments that are going to keep Black Americans, including Black women, from the bar for a long time in many places. Shadd Cary is someone who is sort of engaged enough, right, with the politics of women's rights and suffrage across the color line, that I would love to know more about how she's thinking about that and how that is shaping her. So it's to say, right, that she and her brothers stand in very different shoes in this regard. And I went back to look, in the Howard collection, there is what I take to be her copy of the graduation, the commencement program, where Abraham graduates and she does not. And there's that handwritten note to her, right? Sis, right? I'm about to be admitted to the bar. I might be heading your way. And I would love to treat that as an opening, right? For we get sort of his rather almost lighthearted, right? And clearly excited and sort of proud take on that moment, and no acknowledgement, no hint, right, about where her mind is in this very same moment when it appears, right, that she may have stepped away altogether from her law studies. So Dr. Foreman has a big question, right, about sort of the gendered landscape. My broader view is that Black women are working a different set of concerns than are white women, right, who are indeed looking to use the 14th Amendment to get themselves the right to vote, admitted to the bar, and more. On the one hand, and Black men, right, who are, very much and very much centered the project of political rights, including the project of office holding. This is the 1870s is the moment of, Hall versus DeQueer and Josephine DeQueer, who is going to challenge her relegation, right, to second-class accommodations on a boat headed up the Mississippi River. That Black women are turning to concerns about travel, about violence, about sexual violence, and that is not simply, that is partly an artifact of sort of the gendered landscape, but it is also, I think, a deliberate distinction, right, between the ways in which Black women are thinking about rights and thinking about politics and more, that runs counter to the ways in which white women are thinking about that and Black men are thinking about that in the same moment. So I hope that makes a little sense. But
yes, and thank you so much. And I do want to let everyone know, unfortunately, we have run out of time on the Q&A, but we have all of these wonderful questions still and conversations still simmering in the chat. So I want to encourage folks to hold tight to those because we still have more coming, and to really think through all of the generative ways Dr. Jones's talk has, brought light to questions and topics that reach across various states and borders and topics. And this is just the beginning. So thank you again, Dr. Jones. It has been an honor and a pleasure to have you. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Foreman.
We want to thank you again, Brandy, for moderating this great session. All the questions that were both posed in the chat, but also the conversations that are had in the chat. And then we want to thank both of our keynote speakers, but today, particularly Dr. Jones, for being the perfect speaker to bring the questions about Mary Ann Shadd Cary's legal, thinking as an intellectual, linking it to earlier comments, right, about where Black training happens, where Black educational circles and circuits occur, and how that is embedded in institutional structures and outside of it. It was such a wonder to be able to have a legal scholar who is one of the leading scholars of Black feminist thought and intellectual production come together to rethink with us, in front of us, the ways in which larger audiences are being educated in the law. I had never considered the way in which the press and legal education come together at this moment of such vital fertilization and conversation. And to do so in ways that link us to the conventions is just a gift, as your scholarship always is, Dr. Jones. So we want to thank you over and again for being with us today, and for all the work you offer, and the graciousness, generosity, and fecundity with which you do it. So thank you as a daughter of Shadd yourself, right? Thank you for bringing that and being that with us today. We're going to move now into thinking collectively about ways in which we can commemorate Mary Ann Shadd Cary as we approach the 200th anniversary of her birth. And we're going to move into the thinking and planning for what we ourselves might be interested in doing, classes we might teach, exhibits we might have, grants we might create, or apply for, collections we might digitize, events that we might hold, how we can do that collectively in the spaces that we inhabit ourselves. So we're going to start, we're going to start by asking people to actually show yourselves, and all going to gallery. If you have the time, if you would turn off your screen, since we're going to be thinking together, it might be a really good moment for us to be able to see each other. Thank you, guys. We're going to get as close to the room as we can get, to being in a room together when we do that kind of strategic planning. So many people who I've met and haven't met that we just really, it's great to see you guys. All right, we're going to start by doing just 3-minute snapshots of some of the planning that's already been done, not as a presentation, but as a way to start getting us to think through ideas that we might have. Not only ideas about new projects, but ideas about how we might expand on and extend the reach of projects that have already happened. There have been people doing this work for a long time, not only Shadd family that is in the room, right? But people who have been doing work in Black historical societies. I think Lopez Matthews has told us, has warned us, right, about the moment of what was called in some, that kind of tokenism that can come with the anniversaries. So we want to honor the deep work that has already been done, but also think about the ways in which we can build on it collectively and regionally and individually in our own spaces as we get to 2023. And so I'm going to move this to Arlene, who is standing in for Arlene Wilson and Curtis Small today. Some of the work that they did planning for exhibits at the Delaware Historical Society and the University of Delaware. Of course, Wilmington is one of the places that's just blocked the Delaware Historical Society from where the Shadd family lived. And then Sean Smith will talk a little bit about his work. And then Irene Moore Davis will talk about the work that is happening too in Ontario. So we're really interested in hearing about this. I'm going to ask you guys to do it quickly, right? Again, this is really a way for us to initiate ideas. Then all of us are going to have a moment to talk a little bit about what we do very quickly into the room. Then we'll take a second to write a little bit about what we might do, how we might apply this to ourselves. Then we'll go into small breakout rooms, maybe dyads, in order to think through this with an audience, right? Like just a little bit of brainstorming together. Then we'll come back debrief, talk a little bit about next steps, and we'll go on from there. We expected this to be a small session, but we really wanted the thinkers and the doers of the word, right, to get back to some early and important work, to be in the room together and have a chance to think collectively. So I'm going to hand this over to Arlene, where she can show just a couple of slides and in 3 minutes, talk a little bit about the planning that DigBlack and the Center for Black Digital Research was really happy to sponsor with the Delaware Historical Society and UD and the College of Arts and Sciences there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Foreman. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. I'm Arlene. I have been working on a Marianne Shadd Cary exhibit with the Delaware Historical Society for the last 3 months or so. My colleague, Kelly Barnes, is not here with us. What I want to do is just share my screen very quickly. I do have a couple of slide presentation or a couple slides that I want to show because I think they're relevant. So Kelly and I, this is the first time we've actually put an exhibit together. And although she was a fellow at the Delaware Historical Society and I was working with Curtis Small at the University of Delaware, we had some resources that we started off with that made putting this project together much easier for us. So the one thing that I had worked on prior to this exhibit project, an archival finder. Gabrielle, is that
Irene? Yeah, it is. I'm so sorry. We can't see the slide. It may not matter that much, but what we're seeing is a white screen. So you may need to stop sharing and then go back and choose what it is that you want to see. Sometimes it does that. Don't worry.
Okay, let me do this. I'm so sorry. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yay, sorry about that. Okay, I'll talk fast. So the reason why I want to show this is because Kelly and I really thought that we started off with resources that made our project, the exhibit work so much easier for us. Prior to embarking on the exhibit project, I had worked on a spreadsheet with another colleague to create an archive finder. We searched through multiple repositories and databases to find any and all archival material on Marianne Shadd Cary specifically and all of her family members, and we put it in a spreadsheet. So before beginning this exhibit project, we had a pretty good idea of what material culture objects and letters and documentations and so forth were already out there, so that when we put together what pieces we might want to request a loan from these repositories, we had that at our fingertips. We also had a contact list of all Marianne Shadd Cary known associates. So that also helped us in deciding the type of narrative we could tell and that we wanted to tell. We also consorted with Brandy Locke, who had done a digital exhibit project through the Color Convention Project on Marianne Shadd Cary. And she was crucial in helping Kelly and I kind of figure out and parcel out the type of narrative and what story we wanted to tell. We also had points of contact with UD Library and the Delaware Historical Society. So we just basically took 3 quick steps. The first one, we immersed ourselves in the information. We read biographies. I visited the University of Delaware Special Collections, and Kelly, who is a historian, PhD candidate, was working the end at the Delaware Historical Society. We found and listed all the things that were related to Marianne Shadd Cary. We looked for social, political, legal conditions for Blacks in Delaware between the dates that we knew that her family was in Delaware and Pennsylvania. Once we gathered this information, then we started to shape the narrative, taking into consideration what our colleague Brandy Locke had discussed with us. We also met with local scholars, Syl Wilford and Lori Englehart, and I really recommend that if you can find individuals within the society that are not necessarily academics that have been doing this work, that was crucial for us. We found a plethora more information and material culture items that were out there that these scholars had actually found. But then we considered the venue site. We're working with 19 cases. So we had to then visualize and visit that space and determine, based on the space that we have, how much of the story could we tell? And then the third thing, we started to really build out concrete plans, outlining the exhibit in Google Slides, imagining the 19 cases when folks first walk up into that second floor to see the exhibit, what would they see first? And then we started adding the documents that we were finding, listing physical items that we would pull from that archive finder to potentially ask for loans for. And then we started to move towards budgets. What were local archive designers in our area? How much did they charge? Trying to figure out a loose budget of how much money we have to work with, whether or not we would be asking for grants. And then the project is still in the works. So we're continuing that work and also to fill in some of the archival material. If I have a second, Dr. Foreman, if that's okay, I just want to show very quickly. This is the Google slide that we put together. So we have an exhibit outline. These are the major sections that we think that we're going to tell. Now, because the venue is in Delaware, it's the Delaware Historical Society, they really want the Delaware angle, obviously, for Mary Ann Shadd Cary. So Kelly and I were wondering that perhaps we might have a Canada exhibit running at the same time where they took her Canada years. It would seem appropriate if we had, some of the archives from Canada, her life in Canada, but we basically have Delaware, Pennsylvania, and then also DC. So that would be something that, in terms of making this a bigger project and collaborating with Canadian repositories and perhaps even museums that would be willing to do an exhibit, that would be something to discuss. And that, okay, so I'm sorry, I'm going to put it back to Dr. Foreman here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you so much, Arlene, for representing the team that did exhibit planning and for showing us a little bit about your process as you were doing that work as well. I'm going to go to Irene Moore Davis and then we'll go to Sean Smith. Sound good?
Absolutely. I mean, before I begin, I want to acknowledge fellow Shadd descendant Dr. Bruce Purnell, who's in the room from the Washington, D.C. area. So we're really happy to have you. And I also want to acknowledge the amazing Leslie McCurdy. I trust that many of you already know her, but Leslie McCurdy is a fantastic Windsor, Ontario-based actress who regularly portrays Mary Ann Shadd Cary as part of her one-woman play, Things My Four Sisters Saw. So hopefully we'll have a chance to hear from Leslie later on. In terms of some things that are already going on the Canadian side, the National Newspaper Association has recently committed to offer an annual award in the name of Mary Ann Shadd Cary, and we're really excited about that. It's going to be based on columnists because she had such an amazing editorial footprint. So I'm not sure when exactly that's being launched. It might be 2022 ahead of 2023, but that's exciting. That's sort of like Canada's equivalent of the Pulitzer. So we're really excited about that. Here in Windsor, you may have noticed my backdrop is sort of a sculpture, a bit of a detail of a sculpture. Our local amazing artist, Donna Main, has created a bronze sculpture of Mary Ann Shadd Cary, which is finished and it's in storage at the University of Windsor, awaiting a safe time for us to fully install and unveil that. So that would have actually happened yesterday, but our pandemic situation here isn't so great. So that's been delayed to spring 2022. One of the things that's really exciting about that sculpture is that Museum Windsor here in Windsor is also interested in, now that there's been a delay, creating a small exhibit around that sculpture and in commemoration of the 200th anniversary. So we're really excited to work with them on that. When I say we, I mean the Essex County Black Historical Research Society. So those are some of the things that are going on. I do want to mention as well, another Shadd descendant has been involved in a new children's book that's coming out through Scholastica regarding Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Of course, we want to lift up and pay homage to the great children's book that Rosemary Sadler already wrote about Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Rosemary Sadler being the former president of the Ontario Black History Society and quite a wonderful historian. So there's a new children's book for even younger readers coming out regarding Mary Ann Shadd Cary. and that is expected in fall of 2022. So those are a few of the jumping off points that could really result in some good things. I know at the Essex County Black Historical Research Society, one of the things that we've kind of become specialists in is partnering on curriculum projects that help to develop the resources that schools and teachers need to properly convey and lead discussions about our history. So we've partnered with the Greater Essex County District School Board on another update to the Roads to Freedom, African Canadian Roads to Freedom documents, which are resource documents for grades 1 through 10 that are used in our local English public school system. We recently just completed a project for a cross-border curriculum about the Underground Railroad with the University of Michigan. And we are putting in some grant applications to come up with some specific curriculum resources that pertain to Marianne Shadd Cary around the 200th anniversary. So we're really looking forward to having something that's ready to hit the ground running in that academic year and give teachers a better opportunity to really explore the meaning and impact of this person who lived right here in Windsor and about whom too few Windsorites and Essex County residents still know. So that's it for me. I'm going to turn it back to Gabrielle.
Yeah, that's it. Just all of that. We want to say ashe and hallelujah to all the work that is being done, and particularly the children's book, the curriculum work, the sculpture. I mean, there's just such. Of course, it makes sense that so much harvesting and growing would be done in our mother's gardens where she planted herself, right, and her family and her descendants are as well. So thank you very much for letting us know about that work. Sean, if you would go ahead and share a bit about what you guys are doing.
Yes, and I have some slides, so I'll be happy to share those too. Yeah, so this is, we can go to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. So yeah, essentially the question becomes why us, why the Archives of Ontario? And as we spoke about this morning, we are one of the repositories that has a significant amount of material related to Marianne Shadd Cary. Right now it's all material on microfilm, but we are going to be receiving the original material to preserve. And in doing so, we have reached out to historical societies in Chatham, Buxton, to just sort of discuss the best place for those records, and in the end, to decide to come to us. And also, as part of that, we've committed to digitizing the entire collection and sharing it with the Transcribe Shadd project, which is super exciting. And then just following through on our commitment to ensure that this material, gets out to the community, that is widely used, is known to be available for use and incorporation into any projects that are going on. So we can go to the next slide. So we met at the Archives of Ontario. I'm a senior archivist, so I met with some of my managers just sort of to make sure that we were all on the same page and that we were committed to working with this material going forward, understanding the importance of the 200th anniversary. And just some ideas that came out of that and that we're looking forward to exploring. Obviously, collaborating with other institutions locally and internationally. Arlene, for example. We have experience in exhibits online and in person, and certainly with the experience of the pandemic, we'll probably be pivoting a lot more to online exhibits, but if that's something we can do in coordination with institutions across the border in other places in Canada to sort of really make sure that we're telling a multifaceted story, and then we're bringing sort of the role and the of Marianne Shadd Cary within Ontario's story out to many people, then that's something we're excited to look at. We mentioned this morning the idea of just bringing all of the archival material together intellectually in one place, so that an individual who's interested in exploring sort of the story of Marianne Shadd Cary based on primary source material, they can go to one portal. They don't have to go to multiple portals or multiple places in order to see the material. Certainly the idea of hosting a speaker series of some kind that we can do virtually, that we can do in person. That gives us many opportunities to bring people together from many different places to sort of reflect on the importance of the anniversary and the life of Marianne Shadd Cary. We're already revisiting and taking a look at our online exhibits related to Black histories in Ontario, and certainly having the original material from the Robbins family will allow us to sort of work with the Ontario Black History Society and others in making sure that that material gets a prominent place within those stories. Outreach and promotion is something that we do, but certainly we will be reaching out to all of the Ontario Public Service networks, all Shadd Cary descendants, Black History Societies, and again, just making sure that this isn't material that gathers dust, but it's material that that raises up and takes on life. And then I know that we talked about this with Brooke, with Lopez some time ago, but let's see what kind of a practicum placement we can create. Maybe not necessarily for an archival student, but for somebody who can have a meaningful experience interacting with this material firsthand. Next slide. I realize I repeated myself in one bullet here, so I apologize for that. But of course, we'll commit to a social media campaign to bring attention to the anniversary. But the one idea that I'm kind of excited to look at developing a bit more. Over the course of the last year, I worked on a nomination of the Alvin D. McCurdy Fall, which is probably one of the most important collections of Black histories in Ontario. And which I assume Leslie McCurdy is familiar with, but it's quite a process to go through, but we worked with the Amherstburg Freedom Museum and the Ontario Black History Society in developing a nomination of that material to CC UNESCO's Canada Memory of the World Register. It elevates the collection. It obviously brings a lot of focus to it. And from an institutional point of view, what that does is it means that we're committed to ensuring that this material gets the attention it deserves over time. So we'll be bringing in a practicum student in January to look at the descriptions of that material, see if we can tease out more information within it, looking at digitization opportunities. So it would be really exciting to go through the same process with the Marianne Shadd Cary material and look at least for the CC UNESCO side of things, to see if we could do that in conjunction with Library and Archives Canada. And if we could time it so that the announcement was made close to the anniversary, I think that would be super exciting. The other one that we could look at as well is the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. And I don't know enough about the process to speak about it confidently right now, but that is certainly something that we could look at across institutions to see if that's something we could do to elevate sort of this history to a worldwide audience. But if that would be possible, then it's something to look towards. And then my last slide is just a contact me slide, but feel free to reach out if anybody has any questions or wants to follow up on any of these ideas. If we don't exchange contact information in the breakout rooms, certainly feel free to reach out at any point in time, but we're super excited to move towards seeing what we can do. And if anybody's interested, this is an image of Fred Davis, who was one of the first lawyers in Windsor, and it is from the Alvin D. McCurdy Fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. I'm gonna open this up actually for literally 3 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes for other people in the room who are doing important work on Marianne Shadd Cary who would like to either put it into the chat or would like to put it into the room verbally. I'm going to start by asking Nika Denny, who is here, if she has any announcements that she'd like to share.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Hi, folks. I am currently an assistant professor of history at Washington and Lee University. And I am working right now on a Shadd Cary primary source reader that is under contract with Oxford University Press. And we are planning to have it out before the 200-year anniversary. So it will be at some point in 2023. Not sure if it'll be more like spring for Douglas Day or just later on in that year. But at some point during 2023 is when the book will be released. This is a collection that has work spanning 1848 to 1888, I believe, are the years that I'm looking at. The chapters are examining Shadd Cary's perspectives on racial uplift with an emphasis on labor, women's rights, immigration. And I also have a chapter called Contextualizing Shadd Cary that has some commentary from her contemporaries. So this is something I'm really excited about. That should be finished next month, assuming all goes well, and will be out in time for the anniversary.
Let's all say ashe to that. That was a really nice sort of move over to Jim Casey, who can talk just for a second. He'll talk about it later, but maybe now is a good time to talk about Douglas Day.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Foreman. Hi, everybody. My name is Jim Casey. I'm one of the folks working on the team at the Center for Black Digital Research. We are planning and overwhelmingly excited to work with everybody to put together with our team of folks here a crowdsourcing project that's going to let us bring all of the digitized materials together and then invite everyone to come and help transcribe those materials, create kind of information around them that will help expand the ways that we can get access to them. Of course, we know a stack of PDFs is great for those of us who really want to nerd out and get into them, but we want to make it easier for folks to be able to engage with those things. And so we're planning for 2023 to be able to feature that project, which we're calling sort of quote unquote Transcribe Shadd, at our annual Douglas Day holiday, which is an event we hold each Black History Month as a way of sort of inviting people to help not just sort of remember, but help to recreate Black history in a collective action kind of way. So we'd love to hear expressions of interest from folks who'd love to be a part of that team. I think even if people don't volunteer, we might be tapping folks at various points to get your input, your thoughts, and expertise all around. So we're looking forward to sharing more as we go forward.
Thank you, Jim. Brandy, can you talk just for a minute about the possibility of working with Mural Arts Philadelphia for a mural that
Absolutely.
Lord knows if it'll make it in time, but we hope.
Yeah, I mean, we will be pushing, our metal to the pedal to the metal to make that happen because it would be so fantastic. We've already partnered with Mural Arts Philadelphia, which has literally transformed the landscape of Philadelphia in order to, not only bring public art to the fore, but particularly art that elevates Black histories. And so they've already, decided they are fully on board with a mural that would be located in Wilmington, Delaware, featuring Marianne Shadd Cary. We, always focus on Black muralists and the larger Black community surrounding the mural to engage in that project, because it's more than just putting something up. It's about engaging this history in our communities. And figuring out how to create a sustained memorial to her. So we invite feedback, folks who are interested, folks who would love to be a part of that progress that involves programming, curriculum, you name it, we're interested in doing that. So yeah.
I just want to say that we're really in the preliminary stages of that. What we're doing now is finishing Color Convention's mural in Philadelphia, and then we'll obviously be putting together an advisory committee that includes people in Delaware to choose the artist, to engage, to choose the wall, to be in conversation. So it's a long process that's really in its incipient stages, and that has not been quite announced publicly. So Connie, it hasn't quite been announced publicly, and we'll want to do that with people, with the appropriate people, to make sure that it's inclusive and that all the stakeholders are included. So we're really looking forward to the possibility of that. Kristen, of course, is going to be editing a collection of the papers that come from this volume that we're hoping to have ready for 2023. As well. Shirley, can you talk a little bit about digital editions and the possibility, digital editions of Black Women's Organizing Archive as well? And then we'll go ahead and move to some reflection and into breakout rooms.
Sure. Thank you. Yes. So the Black Women's Organizing Archive, for those who weren't here for the introduction yesterday, is kind of the newest project of the Center for Black Digital Research, and really straddles and is kind of working across all of the different projects of the center, in particular carrying the Color Conventions project's focus on recovering the work of Black women writers and bringing that out to broader publics. And so the Black Women's Organizing Archive is you heard Arlene talking a little bit about bringing together the scattered archives. And that's really the work of the Black Women's Organizing Archive, is to think about how can we bring together these scattered archives, and how can we work with different organizations and institutions to bring together the scattered archives of Black women writers. And so we're doing that work in conjunction with Douglas Day, and you'll see transcribing the papers, but really starting to think through not only how we bring them together, how we work in community to transcribe them, but what do kind of digital editions, digital exhibits, what is that going to look like? What is the platform that brings all of this work together? And so we're starting to think that through. We're really looking forward to being in conversation with many of the people here, and thinking about projects that can support that, how we can do that in community, how we can do that in ways that continue to build pipelines for this scholarship and for future generations and communities to keep doing this work.
I wanted to ask Dr. Rudham to at least she put a note that she's working on curriculum and an NEH grant, but if you would just say hello to all of us, and also for people to make sure that we share our contact information with Dr. Rudham, and Dr. Rudham for you to do the same in back channels would be great, so that we can share curriculum. But please say hello.
Hello, everybody. I'm kind of late to the party, but it's just really great to be here. Thanks for organizing this. I'm really excited to collaborate. My colleague, Dr. Candace Logan Washington, is really the lead on Mary Ann Shadd Cary. So I will definitely put both of our details in, and we're happy to collaborate with Delaware folks, but also to travel possibly to Canada. So I'll be in touch. Thanks again.
One of the things that we've been thinking, Irene Moore Davis, is that since the sculpture got delayed, that maybe this provides us an opportunity to actually have more people head up right from this community, right from the symposium, to really celebrate that sculpture. As she crossed boundaries, maybe we can cross boundaries too, to celebrate the work that is being done there as well. So as Dr. Rudham said, right, maybe we can get to Canada. That would be really lovely. I know that the folks who have been doing performance work under Lynette Overby have also been really eager to be involved in that. I don't know if folks caught that there was a lot of performance work that we did before this symposium. We had a whole year of workshops and performances of Canadian artists and dancers and poets, and US dancers and artists and poets. That was really quite incredible. So please head to Dig Black's website in order to look at some of those, which are all available online as well. We're going to move to thinking and together collectively, but we're also going to turn off the recording so we can kind of really think together. And so I am charged to say thank you to everybody who has come through today as part of the audience, as the presenters. We'd like to thank our funders and all of the audience members and collective thinkers who have done work, who have not made it to the room, who have been available in our Twitter audience, et cetera. And we just want to say thanks to the Delaware Humanities, to Queen's University, to the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm getting all kinds of little notes that are slightly distracting that are going off but we really do want to express our appreciation to the team that is doing the work behind the scenes as well. So I want to say that before the recording is paused, although it's already been paused. So let's take a minute, unless there's anybody else who wants to speak, to just write ideas down for 2 to 3 minutes about what you might want to do in your local communities or in collaboration with people who may be here or who may not be here. Just take a second to literally take a pen out, a pencil, your computer, whatever it is that is most comfortable to you. I will put on a 3-minute marker, time us out, and folks can start to think about how they want to extend their work or create work to new audiences, broader audiences.
Hey everybody across the world today, something is moving. Please don't get